Chapter 1. The shears snapped with a metal-sharp finality, severing a cluster of overripe mint stalks. Saffron Thorne did not look up from the dirt. She focused instead on the pungent, sharp scent that rose from the bruised leaves, a fragrance so aggressive it seemed to scrub the very air. She worked with a frantic precision, deadheading the mint not to encourage new growth, but to maintain a perimeter of scent so oppressive it functioned as a wall. In the damp soil of the library garden, the mint was a green tide, surging against the curated borders of the village's prestige. Saffron knelt in the loam, her skirts already stained a deep, earthy ochre, her fingers blackened at the tips. This was her fortress, a sanctuary where the only expectations were the seasonal rhythms of the soil and the silent demands of the perennials. From the periphery of her vision, the village elite drifted past the iron gates like pale ghosts. She watched them, the daughters of merchants in their stiff muslin, the matrons with their powdered faces, and noted the way they instinctively veered away from the widow's patch. They treated the garden as a site of contagion, as if her mourning were a blight that could leap from the mint to their silk hems. Saffron welcomed the distance. Invisibility was a luxury she had cultivated as carefully as her rare orchids. To be forgotten by the ton was to be free from the performative grief they expected of a widow, the curated size and the precise duration of black crepe. Here, amidst the damp earth and the smell of crushed herbs, she did not have to be a cautionary tale of loss. She was simply a part of the undergrowth. The rhythmic snap of her shears was suddenly severed by a different sound, the sharp, metronomic tapping of a fan against a palm. Saffron froze. The sound was a percussion of power, a signal of arrival that required no announcement. She did not need to lift her gaze to know that the silence of her sanctuary had been breached. The air shifted, the scent of damp earth suddenly warring with a cloying, artificial cloud of night-bloom scent and expensive powder. Beatrix Sterling stepped into the garden, her skirts trailing over the damp earth with a deliberate lack of caution. Each step was a calculated intrusion, the heavy silk of her gown brushing against the mint, flattening the very stems Saffron had spent the morning tending. Beatrix did not look at the plants. She studied Saffron as one might look at a smudge on a piece of fine porcelain. She stopped a mere foot from Saffron's kneeling form, the tip of her fan poised like a weapon. The rhythmic tapping ceased, replaced by a stillness that felt like a held breath before a blow. "The state of these grounds is quite extraordinary, is it not?" Beatrix began, her voice a polished blade of forced kindness. "One almost forgets that a library is intended to be a beacon of civilization, rather than a wilderness of aromatic weeds. It is a curious choice, Saffron, to cultivate a garden that smells so pointedly of a kitchen pantry." Saffron felt the familiar constriction in her throat, a physical tightening that turned her words into stones. She gripped the shears tightly, her knuckles white against the rusted metal. She wanted to explain that the mint was a shield, that the sharpness of the scent drowned out the hollow silence of her own house, but the words remained locked behind a wall of social terror. Instead, she tugged at her apron strings, her eyes fixed on the dirt. The soil requires a balance," Saffron managed, her voice thin and wavering. "The mint, it anchors the perimeter. If one disturbs the root systems too abruptly, the entire structure of the bed collapses. The perennials depend on the stability of the undergrowth." Beatrix tilted her head, a slight, judgmental movement that suggested she found the botanical explanation quaintly irrelevant. Stability is a virtue, certainly, but it must not be confused with stagnation. The library has long been a neglected relic, a crumbling testament to a past that no longer serves our current standing. As the primary patron, I have decided that a modern restoration is imperative. We shall replace these haphazard patches with a formal French parterre, symmetrical, disciplined, and reflective of the prestige this village deserves. Saffron's heart gave a sharp, irregular thud. A French parterre meant the erasure of everything she had built. It meant the removal of the wild corners where the Grease shadows lived, the replacement of her intuitive sanctuary with a curated exhibition of wealth. The autonomy she had clawed back from the ruins of her marriage was being stripped away in a single, clipped sentence. She looked up then, her eyes meeting Beatrix's cold, calculating gaze. She tried to find a word, a plea, a protest, a demand, but the social hierarchy of the village acted as a muzzle. She was a widow of modest means. Beatrix was the architect of the village's social order. She is erasing me, Saffron thought, the realization spiking through her like a needle. She isn't just pruning the garden, she is pruning my existence from the map of this town. To her, I am a weed in a formal garden, a remnant of a tragedy that disrupts the symmetry of her curated world. If the garden goes, where do I go? I have spent 3 years building a wall of green, and she has walked through it as if it were smoke. Beatrix smiled, though the expression that stayed cold. I trust you understand the necessity of this transition. A woman of your precarious standing should be grateful for the patronage that keeps these halls open. It would be a pity if the library were to close entirely due to a lack of aesthetic appeal. You may continue to assist with the transition, provided you can follow a proper blueprint. Without waiting for a response, Beatrix turned on her heel. As she pivoted, her heavy leather shoe landed squarely on a fresh sprig of mint. Saffron watched in slow motion as the stem snapped and the leaves were ground into the mud, the vibrant green crushed into a dull, bruised gray. The sensory shock of it, the smell of the broken plant rising in a sudden, violent burst, felt like a physical blow to Saffron's chest. Beatrix drifted away, her skirt sweeping the earth, leaving behind a trail of flattened herbs and a vacuum of silence. Saffron remained on her knees for a long time, staring at the crushed sprig. The fortress had been breached. The invisibility she had relied upon was no longer a shield, but a vulnerability. She felt a sudden, desperate need to be inside, away from the open air and the judgment of the sky. She stood slowly, her muscles stiff, and wiped her blackened hands on her apron, though the soil only smeared further into the fabric. She retreated toward the heavy oak doors of the library, the sanctuary of the archives. She expected the doors to be locked, as they usually were, during the midday lull, providing her with a private space to breathe among the scent of old vellum and dust. But as she reached for the iron handle, the door yielded with a heavy, echoing creak. It was already unlocked. Saffron stepped into the dim, cool air of the main hall, the silence of the interior pressing against her ears. She moved toward the central reading table, the heart of the archive, but stopped short. Resting on the scarred mahogany surface was an object that did not belong, a large, weathered leather satchel, its straps worn to a pale tan, smelling of old ink and distant travel. Beside it lay a pair of glasses, and a stack of handwritten notes in a script she didn't recognize, but which looked meticulously, obsessively organized. The library was no longer her private ruin. Someone had already moved in. Chapter 2. The ledger was a liar, and Hassan al-Rashid was not a man who tolerated inaccuracies. He stood in the center of the library's main hall, the air thick with the smell of damp limestone and the slow, acidic rot of neglected vellum. He held the volume open with 2 fingers, as if it were a contaminated specimen, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose. "Preposterous," he said, his voice echoing sharply against the vaulted ceiling. To list the acquisitions of 1812 as miscellaneous is not merely an oversight, it is a scholarly crime. One does not simply categorize a first-edition translation of Al-Farabi as miscellaneous. He looked around the room. The archives were in a state of elegant collapse. Shelves leaned at precarious angles, and a single shaft of sunlight illuminated a million dancing motes of dust that seemed to mock his desire for order. He had spent a decade in the great libraries of Europe and the East, mastering the art of paleography and the patience of the scribe, only to return to his childhood home and find the record of its intellect reduced to a series of smudge marks and vague summaries. He felt a surge of academic indignation that vibrated in his chest. He wanted to scrub the walls, to reindex every scroll, to breathe life back into the silent, decaying ghosts of the stacks. But the chaos was suffocating. He needed air, and he needed it before he succumbed to the urge to scream at a book. He pushed through the heavy oak doors, the iron hinges groaning in protest, and stepped out into the garden. The transition was violent. He moved from the monochrome gloom of the archives into a riot of green and gold that felt almost intrusive in its vibrancy. He stopped mid-stride. 10 paces away, a woman stood among the borders. She was dressed in a faded gown of muted gray, her apron stained with the honest dark loam of the earth. She was bent over a patch of soil, her movements slow and rhythmic, almost liturgical. Hassan froze. The academic detachment he had cultivated like a shield, the formal distance of the scholar shattered. The woman turned slightly, and the light caught the profile of a face he had spent years trying to reconstruct from memory. "Saffron?" he whispered. The name felt strange in his throat, a word from a forgotten language. Saffron did not jump, she merely stilled. She did not look up immediately, her gaze remaining fixed on the soil. She tugged at the string of her apron, a small, nervous gesture that Hassan recognized with a jolt of electricity. It was the same habit she had possessed at 12, when they had hidden in the hollow of an old oak to read forbidden poetry. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. He cleared his throat, attempting to summon the polished cadence of a gentleman, but his voice wavered. Saffron Thorn, I had heard you remained here, but the reports were vague. It has been a very long time. Saffron finally looked at him, though her eyes did not quite meet his. She focused instead on the bridge of his nose, or perhaps his glasses. She said nothing. The silence between them was not empty. It was heavy, filled with the ghosts of childhood promises and the vast, yawning gap of a decade's absence. She shifted her weight, her fingers curling around a dried, brown seed pod she had been inspecting. She held it like a talisman, a wall of organic matter between her and the man who had returned from the world. Hassan felt a sudden, desperate need to bridge the distance, yet he found himself paralyzed by the propriety of the moment. He was a man of letters, yet he found himself without a single sentence that did not feel clumsy. He looked away, his gaze wandering to the corner of the garden, where a small, sheltered alcove of stone protected a single, stubborn bloom. It was a pale, iridescent blue, its petals curling inward like a secret. He stopped breathing. He moved closer, his voice softening, losing its formal edge. "The gentianus," he murmured. "The spring gentian. I remember the day we planted the seeds. You told me that if we whispered to them, they would grow faster because they liked the sound of secrets." Saffron's shoulders dropped an inch. She studied the flower, and for a fleeting second a ghost of a smile touched her lips. Not a smile of joy, but of shared recognition. The blue of the flower was an exact match for the ink they had used to map out their imaginary kingdom as children. For a moment, the years collapsed. They were no longer a grieving widow and a foreign scholar. They were two children in a world that had not yet told them how to be lonely. "They do not like secrets," Saffron said, her voice soft and rhythmic, like the rustle of wind through dry corn. "They like the shade and the silence." "A preference I can appreciate," Hassan replied, his voice barely audible. Mr. San replied, "Al-Rashid." The voice sliced through the intimacy like a blade. They both turned to see Beatrix Sterling gliding toward them, her silk skirt sweeping the gravel with a rhythmic, predatory hiss. She held a folding fan closed in her hand, tapping it against her palm in a steady, hypnotic beat. She did not look at Saffron, she looked through her, as if the woman were merely a particularly dull piece of shrubbery. "I trust you have found the archives to your liking, Hassan," Beatrix said, her voice a steady and forced kindness. She stopped beside him, the scent of heavy, cloying lily-of-the-valley trailing after her. "Though I suspect you find the current state of the ledgers challenging. It is a pity that the previous administration was so lax with the accounts." Hassan straightened, his academic posture returning. "Indeed, Mrs. Sterling, the lack of organization is systemic. I believe a complete audit and a revised budget for preservation materials are necessary if we are to save the collection." Beatrix's fan stopped tapping. She tilted her head, a small, judgmental movement. "Budget," she repeated, the word sounding like a curiosity. "Yes, the financial aspect. I have taken the liberty of reviewing the library's endowment. In the interest of efficiency, I have redirected the restoration funds into a discretionary account. It is, of course, managed personally by me. This ensures that no one spends the funds on frivolous academic whims." Hassan blinked. "Redirected?" "But the grants were specifically earmarked for the restoration of the vellum and the repair of the shelving." "They were," Beatrix said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "And they shall be dispensed at my discretion. You will find your salary is quite comfortable, Hassan, provided your work aligns with the aesthetic and social goals I have set for the library. I expect a sanctuary of beauty, not a dusty warehouse of obsolete thoughts. Should your priorities diverge from mine, I fear your tenure here would be remarkably brief." She leaned in slightly, the threat veiled in a velvet tone. "I am the patron, Mr. Al-Rashid. The library exists because I allow it to exist. I trust we understand one another." Hassan felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He studied the crumbling walls of the library, then at the fragile blue gentian, and finally at Saffron, who had retreated back into her silence, her gaze once again fixed on the earth. He had traveled thousands of miles to save these books, only to discover that he had been hired as a curator for a gilded cage, and the key was held by a woman who viewed knowledge as a mere accessory to her status. Chapter 3. Saffron's fingers trembled. the stems of the yellow roses bruising under her grip as she bound them with a length of coarse twine. She worked with a frantic, imprecise energy, her breath hitching in the humid air of the potting shed. In the language of her father's gardens, these were not merely flowers, they were a bridge. Yellow, not the gold of wealth or the crimson of passion, but the steady, quiet hue of friendship. It was a gesture of peace, a silent apology for her retreat in the presence of Mrs. Sterling, and a tentative hand extended to the boy who had once read her poetry beneath the willow trees. She glanced toward the library, where the gray stone walls seemed to lean inward, burdened by the weight of 1,000 decaying spines. The risk was a physical weight in her chest. To leave a gift was to acknowledge a bond, and in the rigid geography of their village, any acknowledgment was a vulnerability. Yet, the silence between her and Hassan had become a void she could no longer endure. She stepped across the damp grass, her boots clicking softly on the stone path, and slipped into the archive hall. The air inside smelled of old vellum and the sharp tang of dampness. Hassan was absent, likely sequestered in the upper galleries or arguing with a ledger, leaving the main desk a sanctuary of mahogany and dust. Saffron placed the bouquet exactly where he would see it, resting atop a stack of linen-bound folios, and vanished back into the garden before the echo of her footsteps could betray her. When Hassan returned, he did not see a gift, he saw a cipher. He stopped short, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose as he stared at the vibrant yellow petals contrasting against the muted brown of the desk. His academic mind, trained in the rigorous discipline of paleography, instinctively sought a key. He did not simply smell the roses, he analyzed them. He noted the saturation of the pigment and the precise arrangement of the petals. He stepped away from the desk and crossed to a nearby shelf, pulling down a weathered copy of The Botanist's Lexicon. He flipped through the pages with surgical precision, his finger tracing the entries until he found the section on rosaceae. He lingered on the passage regarding the yellow rose, reading the definition of platonic affection and friendship twice. He looked from the book to the flowers, a small perplexed frown creasing his brow. He wondered if the gesture was a simple courtesy or a coded message regarding the library's state. To Hassan, the world was a series of texts to be decoded, and Saffron Thorn was the most complex manuscript he had ever encountered. An hour later, he found her in the courtyard struggling with a heavy burlap sack of potting soil. The bag was oversized and leaking a fine mist of peat that clung to the damp fabric of her skirts. Saffron was leaning back, her heels digging into the soft loam, her face flushed with a concentrated effort that bordered on desperation. She refused to ask for help, her jaw set in a line of stubborn autonomy that Hassan recognized from their childhood. "The physics of the lift are against you, Saffron," Hassan said, his voice sounding too formal, too much like a lecture hall, even as his heart performed a clumsy dance in his chest. Saffron didn't look up, though her grip tightened on the burlap. "I am quite capable of managing a bag of earth, Mr. Al-Rashid." "Capability is distinct from efficiency," he replied, stepping closer. He reached down, his movements hesitant. As he grasped the other end of the heavy sack, his knuckles brushed against the rough weave of the burlap, and for a fleeting second his fingers grazed the back of her hand. The contact was electric, a sudden spark that seemed to vibrate through the humid air. Saffron froze, her breath catching in a sharp, audible hitch. Neither of them moved for a heartbeat, the weight of the soil suspended between them. Hassan felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to close the gap, to speak a truth that had been dormant for a decade, but the ghost of Mrs. Eclower. Sterling's presence seemed to linger in the periphery of the courtyard, a reminder of the social precipice upon which they stood. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant chime of the village clock. She stepped back quickly, the sudden distance feeling like a physical loss. Hassan cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "It is a significant amount of soil. I imagine the gentians will appreciate the richness." He wanted to say more, to ask if the roses were meant for him, to tell her that he had spent the last hour reading a textbook just to understand her. But the words remained locked behind his academic reserve. He watched her retreat toward the flower beds, her posture guarded, her fingers tugging rhythmically at her apron strings. Seeking refuge from his own restlessness, Hassan returned to the archives. He spent the afternoon diving into the estate records of the village, searching for the original blueprints of the library's foundation. The room was dim, lit only by the filtered light of a dying afternoon. As he pulled a heavy, leather-bound volume of land grants from the bottom shelf, something fluttered from between the pages. It was a letter, folded into a tight square and sealed with a dollop of dark red wax. The seal had partially cracked over time, the wax brittle and grayed. Hassan hesitated. The letter was not addressed to him, nor to the library. The ink on the envelope was faded, but the name was clear. It was addressed to Julian Thorne, Saffron's late husband. Curiosity, that academic vice, won over propriety. He broke the remaining seal and unfolded the parchment. The handwriting was feminine, hurried, and intimate, the ink bleeding in places where the writer had pressed too hard. Hassan scanned the lines, his eyes widening as he read a fragment of a conversation that felt like a violation. The writer spoke of a mounting desperation and a debt that could not be ignored, mentioning a sum of money that far exceeded the modest means of a man like Julian Thorne. There were mentions of a secret arrangement and a price for silence that hinted at a clandestine life Saffron had never known. He read the words again, the implication settling in his gut like cold lead. If these debts were real, and if the scandal mentioned in the letter were to surface, the meager pittance Saffron relied upon, the very autonomy she fought so hard to preserve, could be stripped away in a single stroke of a lawyer's pen. Hassan looked up from the letter to the bouquet of yellow roses still sitting on the mahogany desk. The vibrant color now seemed jarring, almost naive. He thought of Saffron's trembling hands and her fierce, quiet dignity. He realized with a jolt of dread that the bridge she had tried to build with those flowers was anchored in a soil that might be poisoned. He held the letter in his hand, the secret weighing more than the bag of soil he had carried, wondering if the friendship he was rediscovering was merely a fragile veil draped over a ruin. Chapter 4. It is not a subspecies of the S. digitalis, but a divergent variation of the Slinaria, Saffron whispered, her finger hovering a mere fraction of an inch above the yellowed vellum. Hassan leaned in, the scent of old paper and the faint lingering musk of dried pressed flowers enveloping them both. The volume was a behemoth of a book, bound in cracked calfskin that groaned whenever they turned a page. They were tucked into the furthest alcove of the archives, where the light filtered through high, dust-moted windows in long, slanted columns. The air here felt thick, as if the weight of 1,000 dead authors was pressing down on them, creating a sanctuary of silence that existed independently of the village outside. The morphology of the root system suggests otherwise, Hassan countered, his voice low and rhythmic, matching the hushed cadence of the room. He pointed to a meticulous copperplate engraving of a root network that looked like a map of some subterranean city. Look at the lateral spread. Acelinaria would never exhibit such a profound descent into the loam. This is a specimen designed for drought, a survivor of the arid plains. Saffron shifted, her shoulder brushing against his coat. She did not pull away. Instead, she tilted her head, her gaze fixed on the illustration with an intensity that bordered on the devotional. You see the anatomy, Hassan, but you forget the soil. A plant does not merely exist in a vacuum of classification, it responds to the earth it inhabits. If this were grown in the heavy clay of the valley, the roots would be stunted, but in the sandy loam of the coast, they would stretch exactly thus. Without realizing it, Hassan had mirrored her posture. He was leaning forward, his spine curved in the same tentative arc as hers, his breath hitching in time with her own. He felt a sudden sharp awareness of the distance between them, or rather, the lack of it. The academic debate, usually his shield, had become a bridge. He found himself less interested in the Slinaria, and more captivated by the way Saffron's voice softened when she spoke of the earth, as if she were sharing a secret meant only for the plants. Perhaps, he conceded, his voice dropping an octave, the environment dictates the form more than the lineage. Saffron turned her head slightly. Her eyes were wide, searching his face for a sign of genuine agreement or mere politeness. In the dim light, the amber flecks in her irises seemed to glow. The silence between them stretched, no longer the silence of a library, but something taut and vibrating. Saffron reached out to trace the line of the root system once more, and Hassan's hand moved instinctively to steady the page. Their fingers collided. It was a small contact, the slide of skin against skin on the cool, textured surface of the vellum, but it felt like a thunderclap in the stillness of the archives. Neither of them moved. Hassan felt the warmth of her hand, a stark contrast to the chill of the room. For several heartbeats, the world narrowed down to that single point of contact. The debt he had discovered in the letter, the looming threat of Beatrix Sterling, the rigid expectations of their station. All of it vanished. There was only the scent of old ink and the electric, terrifying proximity of a woman who had spent years hiding in the shadows of her own garden. Oh, what a delightfully rustic scene. The voice sliced through the moment like a blade. Both Hassan and Saffron recoiled as if they had been burned, their hands snapping back to their respective sides. Farah Okoro stood at the entrance of the alcove, her posture a masterclass in performative grace. She was draped in a gown of pale primrose silk that seemed entirely too bright for the gloom of the library, her skirts billowing around her like a curated cloud. In her hand, she held a small, leather-bound social diary and a graphite pencil, which she held poised like a weapon. "Miss Farah," Hassan said, his voice suddenly stiff and formal, his hand flying to adjust his glasses. He stepped instinctively in front of Saffron, as if his physical presence could shield her from the other woman's scrutinizing gaze. "I was not aware you had an interest in botanical classification." Farah did not look at him. Her eyes were darting between Saffron's flushed face and the proximity of their chairs, her gaze calculating and cold. She didn't answer him immediately. Instead, she began to scribble rapidly in her diary, the pencil scratching a rhythmic, aggressive sound against the paper. She tilted her head, a small, thin smile playing on her lips, a smile that stayed cold. Saffron had retreated. She had shrunk back into her shell, her fingers tugging violently at the strings of her apron, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor. The vulnerability that had just existed between her and Hassan was gone, replaced by a palpable, shivering anxiety. "Interest? My dear Mr. Stir." "Al-Rashid, I have very little interest in the dirt," Farah replied, her voice airy and fluctuating in pitch, mimicking the latest affectations of the London season. "However, I have a profound interest in the dynamics of the village. It is so rare to see a widow of such modest circumstances spending so much intimate time in the company of a scholar. One wonders if the archives offer more than just old books." "We are discussing the morphology of this Linaria," Hassan stated, his tone clipped. He felt a surge of protective irritation. "A pursuit of purely academic merit." "I trust you find the pursuit of knowledge a worthy endeavor, Miss Okoro." Farah gave a soft, melodic laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Of course. Knowledge is a powerful tool, especially when one is seeking to secure a new form of patronage. I shall be sure to note the intensity of your collaboration." She stepped closer, the scent of an overbearing artificial violet perfume filling the space. She didn't speak another word to them, but her eyes remained fixed on Saffron, documenting every tremor of the widow's hands. With a final, predatory glance, Farah turned on her heel and swept out of the alcove, the rustle of her silk skirts sounding like a warning. As she departed, a small piece of white lace fluttered to the floor, a scented handkerchief, left behind with an air of calculated negligence. But as Saffron exhaled, a shaky, jagged breath, she noticed something else. Farah had not simply dropped a handkerchief. She had left her diary open on the mahogany table beside them, the pages splayed wide. Saffron leaned forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. There, on the open page, was a quick charcoal sketch. It was an unnervingly accurate rendering of her and Hassan hunched together over the book, their heads nearly touching, their silhouettes blurred in a way that suggested a scandalous intimacy. Beneath the sketch, in a sharp, looping script, were 4 words that made the blood drain from Saffron's face. The scandal of the archives. Chapter 5. The soil was cold and damp, clinging to Saffron's fingernails like a second skin, but she did not mind the grit. She worked in the center of the main garden bed, her movements precise and rhythmic, carving a shallow cradle into the earth for the Esmiosotis sylvatica. To the untrained eye, it was a mere forget-me-not, a common blue speck amidst the greenery. But Saffron had chosen this specific variety for its depth of hue and the clandestine promise it carried. In the silent lexicon of the garden, she was planting a seed of secret love, a bold floral declaration that felt, in the stillness of the morning, like a shout in a cathedral. She spent the better part of 2 hours meticulously masking the bloom. She arranged a screen of common hostas and trailing ivy around the perimeter, creating a living veil. The goal was not to hide the flower from the world entirely, but to ensure it remained invisible to those who looked only at the surface. Only someone with a scholar's eye for detail, someone who understood the patience of growth in the architecture of a leaf, would notice the deliberate gap in the greenery. Only Hassan would find it. As she pressed the last handful of loam firm, Saffron felt a strange, fluttering lightness in her chest, a sensation that threatened to override her usual caution. For a woman whose life had become a study in erasure, this small act of visibility felt like a revolution. "You are digging with a fervor that suggests you are burying a body, or perhaps planting a kingdom." A melodic voice drifted across the hedge. Saffron jolted, her hand slipping in the mud. She looked up to see Nalini Deshmukh leaning against the wrought-iron gate, her silk shawl draped with an effortless grace that always made Saffron feel as though she were made of coarse wool. Nalini's smile was a knowing thing, the kind of expression that suggested she had already read the ending of a book Saffron had only just begun to write. "I am merely tending to the perennials, Nalini," Saffron replied, though her voice lacked its usual steadiness. She wiped her hands on her apron, the fabric already stained with the dark evidence of her mourning. "The soil is particularly receptive today." Nalini stepped into the garden, her boots clicking softly on the stone path. She didn't look at the larger beds. Instead, her eyes tracked the sheltered spot where Saffron had just finished. "The soil is always receptive to those who speak its language. Tell me, is this a conversation for the public or a private correspondence?" Saffron paused, her gaze drifting to the blue petals peeking through the ivy. A soft, rhythmic hope entered her tone, her words slowing as she sought the exact phrasing. "It is a tentative inquiry. A way to signal that the silence between us is no longer a void, but a bridge. I wanted to tell him that I remember the way he used to describe the stars, and that I find the archives more welcoming since his return." Nalini laughed, a warm sound that seemed to brighten the gray Regency morning. "My dear Saffron, you are a master of the subtle, but do not let subtlety become a cage. The world is far too loud for whispers alone. Be bolder. If you wish to claim a place in his heart, you must eventually step out from behind the hostas. Happiness is a predatory thing. If you do not seize it, someone else, someone far less deserving, will surely take it from you." Saffron looked down at her muddied boots, the weight of propriety pressing back down upon her. "I cannot simply be bold. The village has a memory like a ledger, Nalini. Every transgression is recorded, and the interest is paid in reputation." "Then let them keep their ledgers," Nalini countered, her hand resting lightly on Saffron's shoulder. "There is a profound dignity in choosing one's own joy over the approval of people who view a garden as a mere accessory to a house. Your heart is not a curated exhibition, Saffron. Let it be wild." For a moment the two women stood in a shared, comfortable silence, the air smelling of damp earth and the faint, lingering scent of the rain that had passed overnight. Saffron felt a rare surge of confidence, a belief that the secret love bloom would serve as a beacon, drawing Hassan toward her in a way that words never could. She spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of quiet anticipation, imagining the moment his glasses would catch the shade of blue, the moment he would realize that the garden was speaking to him. When Saffron returned to the garden the following morning, the mist was still clinging to the grass in silver threads. She walked with a light step, her mind already composing the conversation she hoped would follow the discovery of the flower. But as she reached the center bed, the lightness vanished, her breath hitched. The Myosotis sylvatica had not merely wilted, it had been obliterated. The plant had been violently ripped from the soil, the roots exposed and shriveled like skeletal fingers. The delicate blue petals were no longer a beacon, they were crushed into the dark, clinging mud, trampled by a heavy heel into a bruised, unrecognizable pulp. The ivy screen she had so carefully constructed had been torn aside, leaving the site of her confession exposed and violated. Saffron sank to her knees, her fingers trembling as she touched the ruined stem. A sharp, jagged feeling of exposure washed over her, as if someone had reached into her chest and stepped on her heart. This was not the work of a stray dog or a sudden frost. This was a calculated act of erasure. The vulnerability she had allowed herself to feel the day before now felt like a liability, a wound left open for the world to see. She began to search the mud, her movements frantic, searching for any sign of who had done this. Her fingers brushed against something coarse and unnatural. Hooked deep into the remaining thorns of a nearby rosebush was a small, distinct scrap of white lace. Saffron pulled it free, the fabric delicate and expensive, featuring an intricate floral pattern that was far too costly for any servant or village girl to possess. Saffron's blood ran cold. She recognized that specific lace. It was the same trim that adorned the high collars and cuffs of Lady Beatrix Sterling's favorite morning gowns. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. This was not a random act of vandalism, it was a warning. Beatrix had not only seen the flower, she had seen the intent behind it. The message was clear. Saffron's private heart was under surveillance, and any attempt to cultivate a life beyond the boundaries of her station would be met with absolute destruction. Saffron remained on her knees, the scrap of lace clutched in her hand, feeling the sudden, oppressive weight of the village closing in around her. The garden, once her sanctuary, now felt like a trap. It really is a shame about the blue ones. A voice drifted from the edge of the garden, airy and fluctuating in pitch. They are such a fragile species. One wrong step, and they simply vanish. Saffron froze and turned slowly. Standing at the perimeter of the garden, framed by the gray stone wall, was Farah Okoro. She was dressed in a gown of pale primrose, her skirts perfectly smoothed, her posture a study in performative elegance. She didn't move closer, but her eyes, cold, sharp, and glittering with a predatory triumph, remained fixed on Saffron. Farah didn't smile with her lips, but her gaze held the satisfaction of a hunter who had just watched a trap snap shut. She lingered for a heartbeat longer, letting the silence stretch until it felt like a threat, and then, with a flick of her wrist, she turned and swept away, the rustle of her silk skirts sounding like the closing of a cell door. Chapter 6. The scent of ambergris and heavy lilies clung to the library's great hall, a cloying mixture that felt less like a celebration and more like a burial. Saffron stood by the mahogany wainscoting, twisting the fabric of her charcoal silk gown, a dress 5 years out of fashion and tight across the shoulders. She felt the gaze of the village elite sliding over her like a cold current, weighing her frayed hem against their shimmering satins. To them she was a ghost haunting her own life, a widow present only by the grace of the patroness. Across the room candlelight flickered in the crystal chandeliers, casting dancing shadows that mocked Saffron's stillness. She focused on a potted fern in the corner, noting the yellowing of the lower fronds, a sign of overwatering. It was a small, botanical failure, but the only thing in the room she felt qualified to judge. The air was thick with the snap of fans and the hum of conversations that shifted into a vacuum of silence the moment she stepped within earshot. Lady Beatrix Sterling moved toward the center of the room, the crowd parting with military precision. Draped in iridescent cream, her waist cinched to an improbable degree, she tapped a painted fan rhythmically against her palm. 3 short strikes. A silence. 3 more. It was the sound of a gavel in a courtroom where Beatrix was the sole judge, jury, and executioner. "Pray, lend me your attention," Beatrix announced, her voice a polished, artificial warmth. She stepped onto the small dais, her gaze landing with surgical precision on Saffron. "We gather tonight not merely to celebrate the restoration of our archives, but to honor the civilizing influence a well-curated library brings to a provincial outpost. Knowledge, after all, is a mirror. It reflects not only the wisdom of the ancients, but the order and propriety of the society that preserves it." Saffron felt a sharp prickle of heat climb her neck. She looked down at her scuffed leather shoes. The speech was a performance of virtue, but the subtext was a reminder of who held the keys to the kingdom. The guests remained breathless, waiting for the inevitable turn of the screw. "In the spirit of this renewed order," Beatrix continued, her tone shifting to exaggerated charity, "I have reflected on the logistical inefficiencies of our current arrangement. The gardener's quarters, while quaint, are poorly situated. To ensure a more streamlined operation, and to relieve the burden of isolation from our dear Mrs. Thorne, I have decided that the gardening staff and their residents shall be moved to the servants' wing adjacent to the kitchens. I believe Saffron will find the proximity to the domestic staff quite comforting." The silence that followed was absolute, the silence of a social execution. To move Saffron from her independent cottage to the servants' wing was a formal demotion of caste. It was a public declaration that Saffron Thorne was no longer a lady of the village, however impoverished, but a mere employee of the Sterling estate. Saffron froze, her breath hitching. She felt a violent urge to melt into the mahogany walls. Her hands gripped her apron strings, which she had forgotten to remove from her gown, and the patterns of the Persian rug blurred into a kaleidoscope of red and gold. She tried to find some shred of defiance, but her voice had retreated deep into her chest. She could hear the collective intake of breath from the crowd as they leaned in to witness the wreckage of her dignity. "A most sensible arrangement, is it not?" Beatrix asked, her eyes glittering with predatory satisfaction. "It is an absurdity." The voice sliced through the tension like a blade. Saffron looked up to see Hassan al-Rashid stepping forward from the periphery. He had been standing in the shadows, his glasses reflecting the candlelight, looking every bit the detached academic. But as he moved into the light, the passivity vanished. He invaded the space, breaking the invisible circle of the ton with a stride far too confident for a man of his social standing. He stopped a few feet from the dais, his posture rigid. When he turned to Beatrix, his expression was one of clinical observation, as if he were analyzing a flawed manuscript. "Lady Beatrix," Hassan began, his voice formal yet ringing with an intensity that made several guests recoil. While I admire your commitment to efficiency, such a move would be a catastrophic error in scholarly preservation. The archives are not merely piles of parchment, they are living entities, linked to the biological history of this region. Mrs. Bressel. Thorne's expertise in botany is not a service to be managed, but a prerequisite for the library's survival. The chemical compositions of the soil surrounding the archives influence the humidity and acidity of the lower vaults. To remove the gardener from her sanctuary is to sever the intuition required to protect the very texts you claim to cherish. He stepped closer, his voice dropping an octave. To treat the stewardship of the land as a domestic chore is to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of knowledge. Saffron's role is not one of servitude, but of indispensable intellectual partnership. Without her, these archives are merely dead skin and ink. To demote her is to degrade the library itself. A collective gasp rippled through the room. To challenge Lady Beatrix in public was a social heresy. To do so using the language of intellectual superiority was an act of war. The hierarchy had been fractured in a single outburst. Saffron looked at Hassan, her heart hammering. She had never seen him like this. Not the hesitant man who spoke in soft queries, but a man who had stepped into the line of fire to shield her using the only weapon he possessed, his mind. Beatrix's face went a dangerous shade of pale, her fan frozen mid-air. The mask of benevolence slipped, revealing a raw, cold fury. She could not respond immediately. The logic of his argument had created a social stalemate she could not dismiss without appearing ignorant of her own library's needs. As the gala wound down and the guests dispersed in a flurry of hushed whispers, Beatrix waited. Once the room had emptied of all but a few stragglers, and as Hassan attempted to move toward Saffron, Beatrix stepped into his path. She reached out, her fingers gripping his sleeve with a strength that belied her delicate frame. She leaned in close, her voice a lethal whisper. "You may fancy yourself a protector of ruins, Mr. Al-Rashid, but you have forgotten that I am the one who decides which ruins are allowed to stand. You have just signed the death warrant of your professional reputation." Chapter 7. Nalini Deshmukh did not enter the village council chamber so much as she occupied it. Her presence a vibrant splash of saffron and indigo against the mahogany gloom. She stood before the council members, 5 men whose faces looked as though they had been carved from the same piece of sour apple, and leaned forward, her hands dancing through the air to punctuate a point about municipal charters. The air in the room smelled of old tobacco and damp wool, a stagnant scent that Nalini seemed to slice through with every rhythmic, melodic sentence. To designate the library as a public sanctuary is not merely an act of civic generosity, Nalini said, her voice carrying a confidence that made the councilmen shift in their heavy oak chairs. It is a legal imperative. By the very terms of the original endowment, the archives were intended for the enlightenment of the citizenry, not as a private trophy for the Sterling estate. To allow a single patron to dictate access is to invite a slow death of the village's own intellectual heritage. Saffron stood by the heavy velvet curtains, her fingers twisting a loose thread on her apron. She watched Nalini navigate the minefield of local bureaucracy with a grace Saffron could never emulate. Every time a councilman attempted to interject with a sputtered remark about Lady Beatrix's generosity, Nalini would pivot, her smile lingering just long enough to make the man feel foolish for questioning a point of law. It was a masterful performance of social chess. When the chairman finally cleared his throat and announced that the sanctuary status was upheld, a sudden, sharp lightness bloomed in Saffron's chest. The library was safe. It was no longer a plaything for Beatrix's whims, but a public trust. In the quiet of her heart, Saffron allowed herself a dangerous thought. Perhaps the sanctuary extended beyond the stone walls of the building. Perhaps the shield Nalini had provided created a space where she and Hassan could finally exist without the shadow of a social death warrant hanging over them. That afternoon, the light in the garden was a pale, buttery gold. Saffron moved through the beds with a focused intensity, her shears clipping only the most precise stems. She was composing a message, a silent confession written in petals and scent. She selected white lilies for purity, sprigs of blue cornflower for hope, and a single daring stem of red camellia to signal a longing that she dared not voice. It was a complex arrangement, a botanical vulnerability that whispered, "I trust you, and I am here." She carefully placed the bouquet in the wide stone sill of the archive window, where the glass was clouded with age, and the scent of old vellum leaked through the cracks. Inside the archives, Hassan al-Rashid stopped dead. He saw the flowers from the interior, their colors vivid against the gray stone. But he did not see a gesture of trust. His mind immediately leaped to the letter he had discovered, the jagged evidence of Julian's debts, and the clandestine arrangements that could strip Saffron of everything. To Hassan, the white lilies looked like a shroud, the red camellia felt like a warning of a bleeding wound. He read the arrangement not as an invitation, but as a signal of retreat. He convinced himself that Saffron, terrified by the potential exposure of her late husband's secrets, was marking her territory and then withdrawing behind a wall of formality. When Saffron entered the archives 10 minutes later, her spirit buoyant, she found Hassan standing at the far end of the long table. He did not look up. He was meticulously aligning a set of paleographic charts, his movements stiff and mechanical. The warmth that had defined their recent stolen moments had vanished, replaced by a cold academic distance. The council's decision was a victory for the village, Saffron said, her voice soft, searching for a crack in his armor. Indeed, Hassan replied. He did not turn. His voice was a flat line, the formal tone of a man addressing a stranger in a lecture hall. It is a commendable achievement of administrative law. I shall return to the cataloging of the 17th century manuscripts now. If you could ensure the humidity in the lower vault remained stable, I would be most grateful. Saffron froze. The precision of his words felt like a physical barrier. She watched the flowers on the sill, then at the rigid line of his shoulders. The suddenness of the shift left her breathless, a vacuum where her hope had just been. She wanted to reach out, to ask why the air between them had suddenly turned to ice, but the habit of silence was a heavy cloak. She retreated into the shadows of the stacks, her heart sinking with a weight that felt like wet earth. Driven by a restless, aching need to understand the architecture of the library she had spent years tending, Saffron began to explore the restricted shelving in the back of the archives, the areas Beatrix had strictly forbidden. She found a series of heavy, leather-bound ledgers, their spines cracked and smelling of cedar and rot. As she flipped through the pages, she didn't find poetry or history, but a ledger of payments. Detailed entries showed that Lady Beatrix had been funding the library's restoration not out of a love for knowledge, but as a targeted investment. There were specific payments made to curators to remove certain volumes, and notes on the redaction of genealogical records. Saffron traced a line of ink that detailed the removal of a family history from the 1840s, a record that contradicted the Sterling family's claim to the ancestral lands of the valley. The realization hit her with a sickening clarity. Beatrix didn't want a library, she wanted a curated narrative. She was paying to erase the truth of the village, scrubbing the archives clean of any fact that threatened her perceived nobility. The library was not a sanctuary, it was a laundry for the Sterling reputation. Saffron stepped out into the garden, the ledgers still echoing in her mind. The world felt fragile, as if the very soil beneath her boots was a lie. She found her father, Balthazar, leaning on his walking stick near the edge of the rose garden. He had been watching her, his weathered face etched with a grim understanding. He saw the tremor in her hands and the haunted look in her eyes, and he knew the library's secrets had finally leaked into her soul. He didn't ask what she had found. He simply looked out over the valley, his voice rough and stripped of all ornament. "You've got that look, Saffron. The look of a person who thinks the truth is a shield. In this village, the truth is just a target." Saffron leaned against a stone pillar, her voice a whisper. "She is erasing us, Father. All of us. She's paying to make the past disappear." Balthazar turned to her, his eyes softening, but his jaw remaining set. He reached out a calloused hand and gripped her shoulder, a rare gesture of physical grounding. He had seen the way she studied Hassan, and he had seen the way the world broke people who dared to feel too much in a place governed by the Sterlings. He wanted to protect her from the crushing weight of a hope that could not be sustained by a widow's meager means. "Listen to me," Balthazar said, his voice heavy with a heartbreaking realism. "You can chase the truth, and you can chase that man, but you must remember where you stand. We are the gardeners, Saffron. We tend the earth, we do not own it. Love is a luxury for those who can afford to be hungry." Chapter 8. The mahogany door to Lady Beatrix Sterling's study didn't so much open as it surrendered, swinging back to reveal a room that felt less like a place of business and more like a mausoleum for living things. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and a heavy, cloying musk that clung to the velvet draperies, which were drawn tight against the afternoon sun. Beatrix sat behind a desk of polished ebony, her spine a rigid line that mirrored the geometry of the room. She did not look up immediately. Instead, she continued to write with a silver-nibbed pen, the scratching of the ink on parchment, the only sound in the oppressive silence. "Sit, Mr. Al-Rashid," she said, her voice a thin blade of forced kindness. She finally looked up, her eyes two cold chips of flint. She didn't gesture to the chair so much as she acknowledged its existence. "I have spent the morning reviewing the budget for the archives. It is a precarious thing, is it not? The fragility of paper, the volatility of funding. One misplaced decimal, one sudden change in patronage, and a lifetime of scholarship vanishes into the ether." Hassan felt the familiar urge to adjust his glasses, but he forced his hands to remain still at his sides. The room felt smaller than it had 5 minutes ago. "The restoration is progressing, my lady. The genealogy records are—" "I am not interested in the progress of the ink," Beatrix interrupted, the clip of her words sharp enough to draw blood. She set the pen down with a precise click. "I am interested in the progress of your associations. It has come to my attention that you have developed a most peculiar habit of frequenting the garden of the late Mr. Thorne. A widow's garden is a place for mourning, not for the leisure of a returning scholar. It is a boundary that should not be crossed, not only for the sake of propriety, but for the stability of your own position here." Hassan shifted, the fabric of his coat feeling suddenly too tight across his shoulders. "Miss Thorne is a childhood acquaintance, and her knowledge of the local flora is indispensable to the—" "Do not mistake my patience for ignorance," Beatrix said, her head tilting in that slight, judgmental manner that suggested he was a specimen under a microscope. She leaned forward, the movement slow and predatory. "Let us be excruciatingly clear. You are here by my grace. The funds that keep those archives from rotting into mulch are mine. My connections in London, the curators at the British Museum, the Fellows of the Royal Society, they all answer to the sterling name. Should I decide that your presence in this village is no longer an asset, I can ensure that your academic career is not merely paused, but erased. You would find yourself a pariah in every library from here to Oxford." Hassan felt a cold numbness creep from his fingertips up his arms. The threat was not a blunt instrument. It was a surgical strike. His life's work, the years spent in dusty vaults, the obsessive pursuit of lost texts, the very identity he had forged in the absence of a family, was balanced on the edge of this woman's whim. He watched the ebony desk, the silver pen, the suffocating velvet, and he saw the bars of a cage. If he complied, he would save the archives. He would save his name. He would simply have to excise Saffron from his heart, as if she were a corrupted line of text in an ancient manuscript. He stood in the silence for a moment, his mind racing through the logic of survival. Is a career worth the silence of a soul, he wondered? He thought of the archives, the smell of old vellum, and the thrill of discovery. Then, unbidden, he remembered the sound of Saffron's voice, that soft, rhythmic cadence that felt like the slow unfolding of a leaf in spring. He remembered the way she tugged at her apron strings when she was unsure, and the way she studied a flower not as a specimen, but as a secret. The realization hit him with a physical force. The archives were dead things, preserved in salt and ink, but Saffron was alive. To choose the library over her would be to choose the curator's case over the garden. "I see," Hassan said, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "Your terms are quite explicit." "They are," Beatrix replied, already returning her attention to her papers, the dismissal implicit in the movement. "I trust you have the sense to prioritize your future over a momentary lapse in judgment. You may go." Hassan exited the study, but he did not return to the archives. Instead, he walked with a feverish intensity toward the edge of the village, his boots crunching on the gravel. He spent the remainder of the evening in a state of focused agitation. He did not reach for his books or his paleography tools. Instead, he went to the potting shed, his hands shaking as he gripped the handle of a heavy iron spade. He began to dig, not with the precision of a scholar, but with the desperation of a man who had just burned his only bridge and found he liked the heat of the fire. He spent hours in the damp earth, gathering the most provocative specimens he could find. He bypassed the modest daisies and the cautious lilies. He sought the riotous, the forbidden, the explicit. He gathered deep, blood-red roses, their thorns tearing at his palms. He sought out the tangled, exotic passion flowers that looked like crowns of fire. He added sprigs of red hyacinth and the bold, unapologetic crimson of the gladiolus. He worked through the twilight, the dirt staining his cuffs and his fingernails, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was no longer translating a dead language. He was inventing a new one. By the time the moon had climbed high over the valley, Hassan had constructed a floral arrangement that was less a bouquet and more a scream. It was a chaotic, vivid explosion of red and purple, a violent contrast to the muted grays and greens of the garden path. He placed the arrangement directly beneath Saffron's window, where the moonlight would hit the crimson petals and make them glow like embers. In the secret language of floriography, it was an admission of everything, passion, longing, and a total, reckless devotion that ignored every rule of the ton. As he stepped back to survey his work, his chest heaving, he felt a sudden, chilling sensation of being watched. He looked up toward the Sterling Manor, perched on the hill like a vulture. There, on the high stone balcony, stood the silhouette of Lady Beatrix. She was a dark smudge against the pale stone, and even from this distance he could see the rhythmic, slow motion of her hand. She was tapping her fan against her palm, a slow, murderous beat that sounded, in his mind, like a gavel coming down. He had done it. He had traded the security of his profession, the respect of his peers, and the stability of his future for a collection of dying stems and a gamble on a woman who might still be terrified of the world. He studied the red roses, then back at the balcony, and realized that the war for the village had shifted. He was no longer a guest or a scholar. He was a combatant. He stood in the dirt, bleeding from a dozen small cuts, waiting for the dawn to reveal whether Saffron would see the flowers as a lifeline or a liability. Chapter 9. The dew had not yet evaporated from the grass when Saffron pushed open the casement window, the hinges giving a sharp, rusted protest that echoed through the morning stillness. She froze. Below her, resting against the damp stone of the cottage wall, lay a riot of color that looked as though a piece of a tropical jungle had been violently transplanted into the gray English dawn. The red roses were not the polite pale pinks of a tea garden. They were the color of fresh arterial blood, deep and bruising. Beside them, the passion flowers curled like exotic crowns, their intricate filaments reaching upward, paired with the unapologetic, jagged spears of crimson gladiolus. Saffron's breath hitched, her fingers tightening on the wooden sill until the grain bit into her skin. She did not need to consult a lexicon. She had been raised in the dirt and the scent of crushed stems. This was not a gesture of friendship, nor a tentative inquiry of affection. This was a scream. It was a reckless, public declaration of a passion so absolute that it bordered on the sacrilegious. Hassan had not merely spoken to her, he had thrown his entire reputation into the mud at her feet. A sudden, dizzying warmth flooded her chest, a feeling of being seen, truly seen, that made her feel dangerously exposed. For a moment, the world narrowed to the scent of those roses, a heavy, cloying perfume that drowned out the smell of old paper and mourning wool. Saffron. The voice was a rough snap that shattered the silence. Saffron recoiled from the window, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She turned to find her father, Balthazar, standing in the doorway. He was not wearing his gardening smock, but his formal coat, the wool frayed at the cuffs. His face, usually a map of weathered contentment, was drawn and grim, his knuckles rubbing together in a slow, anxious friction. He didn't look at her. He studied the floor, his gaze fixed on a loose floorboard. "What has happened, father?" Saffron asked, her voice sounding thin and distant to her own ears. She instinctively reached for her apron strings, tugging them tight, a physical attempt to anchor herself. "Lady Beatrix," Balthazar said, his voice dropping an octave. "She has sent word through the steward. The library cottages are to be cleared. She claims the restoration requires specialized quarters for the visiting consultants from London. You are to vacate by the end of the month, Saffron. She is exercising her right as the primary patron." The room seemed to tilt. Saffron felt the air vanish from the space, replaced by a cold, suffocating vacuum. The library cottages were not merely housing. They were the perimeter of her sanctuary, the only place where the village's judgmental eyes could not reach her. To be evicted was to be cast out into the open, a widow with no protector and a dwindling purse, entirely at the mercy of a woman who viewed her as a smudge on a polished mirror. The joy of the flowers evaporated, replaced by a crushing sense of guilt. Hassan had risked everything for her, and in return the world was closing in. "She cannot simply throw me out," Saffron whispered, though she knew the legalities of the estate were a labyrinth designed to trap people like her. "She can," Balthazar replied, finally looking at her. His eyes were clouded with a mixture of pity and frustration. "And she will. Unless you find a way to make yourself indispensable to her, or a way to leave this village entirely. The seasonal assembly is in 2 weeks, Saffron. Once the guest lists are finalized and the social order is reset, there will be no one left to plead your case. You will be a ghost in your own home." Balthazar left her then, his footsteps heavy and slow, leaving a silence that felt like a physical weight. Saffron did not cry. Instead, she walked out into the garden, her movements mechanical. She bypassed the neatly trimmed hedges and the orderly beds of lavender, drifting toward the wilder edges of the plot. The sky began to bruise, shifting from a pale gray to a heavy, oppressive indigo. Then the rain began. Not a gentle mist, but a sudden, violent downpour that soaked through her thin cotton dress in seconds. She collapsed onto the damp earth, her knees sinking into the loam. She didn't move as the rain washed the salt from her cheeks. She lay there, the scent of crushed mint and wet soil filling her nostrils, feeling the cold seep into her bones. She thought of the red roses beneath her window and the sheer, terrifying bravery of the man who had placed them there. Hassan had stepped out of the shadows of the archives to stand in the light, and she, in her terror, had spent years perfecting the art of disappearing. She realized then that her silence had not been a shield, it had been a shroud. By refusing to fight, she had made herself an easy target for Beatrix's cruelty. "You look remarkably like a drowned rat, Saffron. It is a bold-fashioned choice, even for a widow." Saffron bolted upright, wiping mud from her forehead. Nalini stood under a wide, black silk umbrella, her expression a mixture of amusement and sharp intensity. She didn't offer a hand to help Saffron up. Instead, she stood there, a pillar of poise amidst the chaos of the storm. "I have lost everything," Saffron said, her voice shaking. "The cottage, the gardens, Beatrix has won." Nalini stepped closer, the umbrella tilting to shield Saffron from the worst of the deluge. "Beatrix hasn't won. She has merely defined the board. You are playing a game of propriety and submission, and you are losing because you are actually trying to follow the rules. The rules were written by women like Beatrix to ensure that women like you never leave the dirt." "I cannot fight her," Saffron whispered, looking down at her muddy hands. "I don't have the voice for it." "Then stop using your voice," Nalini countered, her eyes flashing. "You are the most skilled botanist in this county. You speak a language that Beatrix cannot translate, but will certainly feel. If you want to survive the assembly, you cannot go as a supplicant. You cannot go as the grieving widow begging for her home. You must go as a threat." Nalini reached into her pocket and produced a cream-colored envelope. The invitation to the seasonal assembly, embossed with the sterling crest. She dropped it onto the wet grass between them. The assembly is where the village's social hierarchy is cemented for the year. It is a theater of performance. If you wish to keep your sanctuary, you must give the audience a performance they will never forget. Saffron looked at the invitation, then at the dark, rain-slicked garden around her. The terror was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it a spark of something else had ignited. It was a hot, sharp defiance, born from the realization that there was nothing left to lose. She thought of Hassan's red roses, the violence of their color, the audacity of their placement. He had stopped translating the past and had begun to write the present. Slowly, Saffron stood up. She ignored the mud clinging to her skirts and the chill in her limbs. She turned away from the cottage and walked toward the furthest, most overgrown corner of the garden, where the plants grew thick and rebellious. She began to move through the brush, her eyes searching not for the elegant or the refined, but for the subversive. She sought the monkshood with its poisonous elegance, the nightshade with its deceptive berries, and the deep, bruised purples of the black hellebore. She didn't gather them with the care of a gardener. She harvested them with the precision of an armorer. As she tied the stems together with a piece of rough twine, she felt the shift in her own spirit. She was no longer assembling a bouquet, she was constructing a weapon. She would attend the assembly, and she would bring with her a floral arrangement that would strip the mask of propriety from Lady Beatrix's face in front of the entire ton. The silence was over. The war had begun. Chapter 10. The Sterling Ballroom was a study in monochrome restraint. The walls were a pale, suffocating cream, and the guests moved like slow-motion ghosts in a sea of muted grays, pale blues, and the heavy, oppressive blacks of those still performing their grief. At the center of this curated stillness stood Beatrix Sterling, her spine a rigid line of steel, her gaze sweeping the room with the clinical precision of a general inspecting a failing garrison. She held her fan with a grip that suggested she might use it to strike anyone who dared breathe out of tempo, her head tilted at that familiar judgmental angle that reduced every guest to a mere curiosity in her collection. Saffron did not enter the room so much as she disrupted it. The heavy oak doors groaned open, and for a heartbeat, the music, a timid string quartet playing something predictably safe, seemed to falter. Saffron was not wearing the charcoal silk of a widow, nor the subdued lavender of a woman seeking forgiveness. She wore a gown of deep, mossy green that clung to her frame with a quiet strength, but it was the arrangement pinned to her bodice and trailing from her wrist that froze the room. It was a violent, beautiful collision of botany, the bruised midnight purple of black hellebore, the poisonous elegance of monkshood, and the searing, arrogant red of roses that looked as though they had been plucked from a fever dream. It was not a bouquet, it was a manifesto written in petals and thorns. As Saffron crossed the polished marble floor, the silence rippled outward from her like a stone cast into a stagnant pond. The gasps were not loud, for propriety forbade such things, but they were visceral, sharp intakes of breath that sounded like a collective shudder. The guests leaned away from her, as if the arrangement were contagious. Hassan, standing near the periphery of the room, did not move. His glasses caught the light of the chandeliers, and his posture, usually so hesitant, suddenly mirrored Saffron's own. He did not look at the crowd, he looked only at her, his expression one of profound, terrified admiration. Beatrix Sterling's fan stopped its rhythmic tapping. The sound of its closure was like a pistol shot in the sudden vacuum of the room. She stepped forward, the silk of her gown hissing against the floor, her face a mask of forced kindness that failed to reach her eyes. "My dear Saffron," Beatrix said, her voice a clipped, high-altitude wind, "I see you have mistaken the seasonal assembly for a village fair. This display is remarkably vulgar. One wonders if your grief has finally clouded your judgment, or if you simply find the concept of station so tedious that you've decided to abandon it entirely. It is entirely unbecoming of a woman in your position." Saffron stopped 3 feet from the matriarch. She did not tug at her apron strings, for she wore no apron, and she did not look at the floor. She looked directly into Beatrix's eyes, her gaze steady and clear. When she spoke, the softness was gone, replaced by a rhythmic cadence that carried to every corner of the silent ballroom. "Position is a curious thing, Lady Beatrix," Saffron replied, her voice resonating with a strength that seemed to surprise even herself. "You speak of station as if it were a mountain we are born upon, rather than a fence you have built to keep others out. This arrangement is not vulgar, it is honest. The monkshood speaks of caution, the hellebore of scandal, and the roses. Well, the roses speak of a truth that does not require your permission to exist." Beatrix's lip curled, her fan tightening in her hand. "You are overstepping, Saffron. You are a guest in this village by the grace of the patronage that sustains your late husband's name." "Patronage," Saffron countered, stepping closer, the scent of the bruised flowers filling the space between them. "Is that what you call the systematic erasure of our history?" "I have seen the archives, Beatrix. I have seen the letters you suppressed and the records you pruned to ensure the Sterling name remained the only one of consequence. You did not preserve the library, you curated a mirror. You have spent years silencing the voices of this village to ensure your own voice is the only one that echoes. You call my flowers vulgar, yet there is nothing more vulgar than a lie dressed in silk." The room shifted. It was a subtle movement at first, a tilt of a head here, a whispered confidence there, but the power dynamic had fundamentally fractured. The guests were no longer looking at Saffron as a social pariah. They were looking at Beatrix as a fraud. The propriety Beatrix had used as a weapon for decades was suddenly revealed for what it was, a cage designed to protect her own fragility. The silence that followed was no longer one of respect, but of a slow, creeping ridicule. Hassan moved then. He did not hesitate or glance toward the exit. He walked through the crowd, his stride purposeful, and came to a stop beside Saffron. In a gesture that shattered every remaining rule of the evening, he reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlocking with hers in a public, undeniable claim. He knew that by doing so, he was forfeiting the academic endorsements Beatrix controlled, tossing his prestige into the fire for the sake of a woman who spoke in flowers. "I find the arrangement exquisite," Hassan said, his voice formal but infused with a warmth that made the room feel cold. "It is the first honest thing I have seen in this house." Beatrix stood frozen. Her face had gone a ghastly shade of gray, the color of the dresses she had forced upon the room. She studied their joined hands, then at the faces of her peers, and realized that the theater of her power had collapsed. The audience had stopped believing in the play. In a sudden, spasmodic motion, her hand tightened too far, and there was a sharp, dry snaps. The delicate ivory ribs of her fan splintered, the silk tearing down the middle. She stood there, clutching the broken remains of her authority, a figure of sudden, pathetic isolation in the center of her own ballroom. 2 weeks later, the silence of the library gardens was no longer a shield, but a celebration. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and reckless growth. The meticulously manicured hedges of the Sterling era had been allowed to soften, their edges blurring into a riot of unconventional colors. Foxgloves surged upward in towering spires of speckled crimson, and climbing nightbloom scent draped itself over the stone arches like a living curtain. Saffron stood by the central fountain, her hands stained with the dark rich loam of the beds. She was wearing a simple linen dress, her hair escaping its pins in a way that would have horrified the assembly. Beside her, Hassan was reading a restored manuscript, though he spent more time looking at Saffron than the vellum. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in shards of gold and emerald, dancing across the pages of his book. He closed the volume and stepped toward her, his glasses sliding slightly down his nose. He didn't speak, he simply reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Saffron leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. They stood together in the center of the wildness, two people who had traded the safety of the shore for the uncertainty of the current. Around them, the garden continued to bloom. Not in the disciplined rows of a curated exhibition, but in the beautiful, chaotic surge of something that had finally been allowed to breathe. Chapter 1. The mahogany shelf resisted. Octavius Vance pressed his weight into the rag, the scent of beeswax and lemon oil thick enough to taste, scrubbing at a stubborn ring of grime left by some previous tenant's inkwell. He worked with a rhythmic, almost desperate intensity, his knuckles white against the dark wood. The shop was a narrow sliver of a building, tucked between a draper and a dormant bakery, and it smelled of damp stone and the sweet, heavy musk of decaying vellum. Every inch of the space felt like a battlefield where he was fighting to reclaim a sense of order from the chaos of his own return. He paused, adjusting his glasses, and brushed a stray speck of dust from his sleeve with a sharp, habitual flick of his wrist. "The ledger belongs on the east counter, Mr. Vance, not perched precariously atop a stack of hymnals like a nesting bird." Octavius stiffened. The click of Vespera Okoro's heels had heralded her arrival seconds before her voice did. She stood in the doorway, her presence filling the cramped room, her fingers steepled in a gesture of clinical evaluation. Vespera did not merely enter a room, she audited it. Her gaze swept from the peeling wallpaper to the haphazard piles of crates, lingering on the smudge of wax on Octavius's cuff. "I was merely assessing the light, Vespera," Octavius replied, his voice soft but precise. "The morning sun hits the counter at 10, which is the optimal hour for bookkeeping." "Light is a luxury, reputation is a necessity," Vespera said, stepping further into the shop. Her tone was resonant, carrying the weight of a woman who had managed estates far more prestigious than this modest storefront. "In this village, a shopkeeper's reputation is his only currency. If the locals perceive a lack of discipline in your arrangement, they will assume a lack of discipline in your accounts. You are not merely selling paper and ink, Octavius. You are selling the image of stability. One misplaced ledger is a signal of instability to a community that prizes nothing more than the appearance of permanence." Octavius sighed, the sound lost in the cavernous silence of the high ceilings. He moved the ledger to the east counter, his movements careful. Vespera watched him with a singular, slow nod of approval, though her eyes remained critical. She knew, as he did, that the venture was a gamble. He had liquidated nearly every asset he possessed to secure the lease and the initial stock, pouring his remaining colonial funds into the sanctuary. There was no safety net. Only the hope that the quietude of the countryside would provide the peace his daughter required. He turned his attention to the center of the room, where a shipment of colonial texts lay in a state of organized anarchy. These were the fruits of his years abroad, heavy, leather-bound volumes on metallurgy, botany, and law. As he reached for a particularly dense tome on the flora of the Antilles, the volume shifted. It slipped from his grasp with a sudden, heavy thud, hitting the floorboards with a sound like a closing coffin. Octavius froze. He knelt and retrieved the book, only to find that the impact had sheared a page from the binding. The paper was old, brittle as a dried leaf, and the tear ran jaggedly through a detailed illustration of a fern. He stared at the ruined page, a sudden coldness settling in his chest. It was more than a damaged book. It was a manifestation of the fragility of his entire plan. One slip, one misplaced step, and the sanctuary he was building for his child could crumble. He ran a finger over the torn edge, the texture rough against his skin, and felt the oppressive weight of his financial desperation. If the shop failed, he would not just be a failure as a businessman, but as a father. "Is something the matter?" Vespera asked, her voice softening slightly, though the sharpness remained. Nothing, Octavius said, closing the book with a snap. A minor casualty of gravity. At that moment, the bell above the door chimed, and a small, tentative figure stepped inside. His daughter looked around the dim shop with wide, curious eyes, her presence bringing a sudden, fragile warmth to the cold stone room. Octavius crossed the floor in 3 long strides, his expression softening into something rare and vulnerable. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, though he mindful of the distance propriety demanded, even in private. "It is not yet finished, my dear," he whispered, his voice taking on a rhythmic, comforting pace. "But it will be. I promise you here your mind will be your own. You will not be a piece on a social chessboard, nor a tool for someone else's climbing. You may read the forbidden poets and study the stars until the candles burn low. This place is yours as much as it is mine." His daughter smiled, a small, knowing thing, and began to wander through the aisles, her fingers trailing lightly over the spines of the books. Octavius watched her for a moment, a fierce protectiveness tightening in his throat, before Vespera cleared her throat, reminding him that there was still work to be done. Seeking a moment of solace, Octavius retreated to the back room. This was the heart of the shop, a narrow chamber where the air was cooler and smelled intensely of old glue and cedar. Here he had a small desk and a single lamp. He began to catalogue a set of rare botanical journals he had acquired from a private estate in London, his movements becoming precise and rhythmic. He loved the act of cataloguing. It was the process of turning chaos into a map. He reached for a leather-bound volume of 18th century poetry, its spine cracked and faded to a pale ochre. As he opened the cover, the binding groaned and something light, thin, and papery fluttered from between the pages. It drifted through the air with a slow, erratic dance before landing softly on the dark mahogany of the desk. Octavius froze. He did not reach for it immediately. He leaned in, his glasses slipping slightly down his nose. It was a pressed flower, a specimen of Jasminum officinale, dried to a ghostly, translucent cream color. But it was not the flower itself that stopped his breath. It was the manner in which it had been preserved. The stem was bent at a precise 45-degree angle, and a tiny handwritten note in a lyrical, looping script was tucked beneath the petal, noting the exact date and the coordinates of the garden where it had been plucked. He recognized the signature of the pressing. It was a technique he had seen only once, a decade ago, practiced by a girl who had seen the world through the lens of floriography and poetry. The precision was unmistakable, a silent language he had once spent every waking hour trying to decode. Octavius sat back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. His heart didn't hammer. Rather, it seemed to slow, as if the air in the room had suddenly thickened. He studied the flower, then at the door, and then back at the flower. He had returned to this village to escape the ghosts of his past, to build a wall of books and propriety between himself and the memories of a youth spent in longing. Yet, the flower proved that the past had not waited for him to return. Someone had been here. Someone had left a marker in the very heart of his sanctuary. He touched the petal, and it crumbled slightly under his finger, a reminder that, while some things could be preserved, they could never truly be restored. He realized, with a jolt of electricity, that Beatrix Moreau had not only remained in the village, but she had walked through his doors before he had even turned the key in the lock. Chapter 2. The bell above the door did not merely chime, it shrieked, a violent metal-sharp clang that shattered the curated silence of the shop. Octavius leaped, the pressed night bloom scent flower nearly slipping from his numb fingertips. He had barely managed to slide the specimen beneath a piece of blotting paper when the draft of the open door swept in, bringing with it the sudden, sharp scent of rain-dampened wool and a floral perfume that smelled of crushed peonies and something expensive, something that belonged in a drawing-room in Mayfair rather than a dusty storefront in the provinces. She entered with a momentum that seemed to displace the very air in the room. For a moment, Octavius could see only the swirl of a pale primrose gown and the rhythmic click of polished heels against the floorboards. Then she stopped. The silence that followed was not the peaceful vacuum Octavius cultivated, but a heavy, vibrating tension. Beatrix Moreau stood 3 paces from the counter, her chest rising and falling in a quick, shallow cadence. Her eyes, a piercing shade of hazel that seemed to hold 1,000 unwritten poems, locked onto his. Octavius felt the sudden urge to retreat into the shadows of the botany section. He studied her, really looked at her, and found the ghost of the girl he had known replaced by a woman of formidable presence. The softness of youth had sharpened into a refined elegance, yet the way she tilted her head, a slight inquisitive angle, remained unchanged. He, conversely, felt the sudden weight of his own austerity. He was a man of ink-stained cuffs and a coat the color of a winter storm, standing in a sanctuary of dead paper, while she looked as though she had just stepped out of a watercolor painting. He reached up and adjusted his glasses, the bridge of the glasses sliding against the perspiration of his nose. He cleared his throat, the sound rasping in the quiet. "To what do I owe the honor of this visitation?" he asked. His voice was clipped, the cadence archaic and stiff, as if he were reciting a ledger rather than speaking to a human being. He gripped the edge of the mahogany counter, his knuckles white, though he prayed she could not see the slight, traitorous tremble in his fingers. Beatrix did not answer immediately. She let her gaze wander over the shelves, tracing the spines of the leather-bound volumes with a slow, deliberate curiosity. When she finally looked back at him, a small, enigmatic smile played at the corners of her lips. It was a look of recognition, but also of challenge. "You always did prefer the company of things that could not argue back, Octavius," she said. Her voice was lyrical, airy, trailing off at the end of the sentence as if she were pondering a metaphor. "Though I must admit, the boy who used to hide in the willow grove has grown into a man of most impressive restraint. Tell me, do you still remember the secret gardens? Or has the dust of these archives clouded your memory of the wilder things?" Octavius felt a sudden, sharp prick of heat in his cheeks. She was pushing against him, testing the strength of the formal shell he had spent years constructing. He wanted to tell her that he remembered every leaf and every petal of those gardens, that he remembered the exact shade of the sky the day she had last spoken to him, but the words felt too heavy to lift. "The gardens of our youth were a pleasant diversion, Miss Moreau," he replied, his voice regaining its scholarly rigidity. "However, I find that the disciplined study of botany provides a far more reliable truth than the whims of a childhood meadow. If you are seeking a particular volume, I should be happy to assist you." Beatrix laughed, a soft, melodic sound that seemed to vibrate in the hollow of his chest. She opened her mouth to respond, but the moment was violently interrupted. The door flew open once more, this time accompanied by a burst of boisterous laughter and the smell of expensive tobacco. "Good heavens, Octavius! I had heard you'd returned to the village to build a temple to boredom, but I didn't realize you'd actually succeeded." Bramwell Finch swept into the room, a whirlwind of flamboyant silk and misplaced energy. He wore a waistcoat of an aggressively bright saffron hue, embroidered with gold thread that caught the dim light of the shop. Without waiting for an invitation, Bramwell drifted toward the center of the room and leaned precariously against a stack of oversized folios, his weight tilting the pile to a dangerous angle. He inhaled deeply, a theatrical expression of distaste crossing his face. "My word, the aroma," Bramwell declared, waving a hand in front of his nose. "It is a most quaint bouquet, a hint of decay, a touch of mildew, and a pungent note of ambition. It is practically a sensory experience in academic martyrdom. Tell me, do you sell the dust by the pound, or is it a complimentary addition to the purchase?" Octavius stiffened, his shoulders squaring. "Mr. Finch, I was unaware that your schedule permitted visits to establishments where work is actually performed." Bramwell let out a loud, melodic bark of laughter, leaning further back until he was nearly horizontal against the books. "Work! You speak of it as if it were a holy sacrament. Look at you, Octavius. You are dressed like a curate at a funeral for a very dull cat. Where is the spirit? Where is the flair?" He gestured expansively to his own shimmering attire. "Life is far too short to spend it in a coat that shares a color palette with a wet cobblestone." Octavius felt the social chasm between them widen. Bramwell represented everything Octavius had tried to excise from his life. The effortless, gliding charm of the landed gentry who viewed the world as a playground. To Bramwell, the bookshop was a curiosity, a quaint little hobby for a man who didn't know how to live. To Octavius, it was a fortress. The contrast between Bramwell's shimmering silk and his own drab wool felt, in that moment, like a physical weight, a reminder that no matter how many rare manuscripts he curated, he would always be the scrawny boy who studied while others played. Beatrix watched the exchange with a quiet, observant intensity, her head tilted. She didn't intervene, she simply watched the friction between the two men, her eyes flitting from Bramwell's arrogance to Octavius's rigid dignity. "I believe I have seen enough for one afternoon," Beatrix said softly, her voice cutting through Bramwell's continued commentary on the virtues of French lace. She moved toward the door, her movements fluid and deliberate. As she reached the threshold, she paused. She didn't turn around fully, but she looked back over her shoulder, her gaze lingering on Octavius for a heartbeat longer than propriety allowed. There was a question in her eyes. An invitation, perhaps, or a warning. "The night bloom scent is blooming early this year, Octavius," she murmured, the words barely audible over the sound of the rain beginning to lash against the window panes. "Some things simply cannot be kept in the dark for too long." She stepped out and closed the door behind her, the bell giving one final, muted chime. Octavius remained frozen behind the counter, the scent of peonies still clinging to the air, while Bramwell continued to lean against the folios, oblivious to the electric silence that had settled over the room. Octavius looked down at the blotting paper hiding the pressed flower, and felt a sudden, terrifying certainty that his sanctuary had been breached. Chapter 3. Chapter title: The Landowner's Shadow. The shears felt heavy and cold in Octavius's grip, smelling of wet earth and old rust. He knelt in the damp mulch of his private garden, where the air was thick with crushed mint and decaying leaves. Before him grew the night bloom scent, its pale petals shimmering like ghostlight against the gray afternoon. With the precision of a man who had spent years cataloging colonial flora, he selected a single perfect sprig. In the silent language of floriography, the night bloom signaled amiability, a cautious, polite olive branch. It was the safest bridge he could build, a gesture that whispered of friendship without daring to shout of longing. He clipped the stem, the sharp snap echoing in the stillness. Returning to the shop, Octavius avoided the main counter, moving toward the poetry section where the scent of old vellum and beeswax lingered. He retrieved a first edition of Keats, the leather binding worn to a soft, buttery texture. His breath came in shallow hitches as he opened the volume to a passage on the permanence of art and slid the sprig between the pages. He knew Beatrix's habits. She would seek the romantics first, her fingers tracing the verse before discovering the blossom. He placed the book prominently on the display easel, the gold lettering of the spine catching the dim light. He stepped back, palms damp, feeling as though he had left a piece of his own pulse exposed on the mahogany wood. He needed air. The walls of the shop, usually his fortress, suddenly felt like the interior of a coffin. He pushed through the heavy oak door onto the cobblestone path, the rain having tapered into a clinging silver mist. The village of Oakhaven was settling into the blue hour, the distant chime of the parish clock marking the time with heavy finality. He walked toward the edge of the village, his mind looping over the look in Beatrix's eyes. He wondered if she had seen through his drab wool coat to the man beneath, or if she merely saw a ghost of the boy he had once been. His path was abruptly severed. Standing in the center of the lane, blocking the way with sculptural stillness, was Cassian Thorne Windsor. He was mounted on a sleek, charcoal-gray stallion that looked polished with silk. Cassian sat perfectly upright, his spine a rigid line. He wore a riding coat of midnight blue, the brass buttons gleaming with a cold, predatory light. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he withdrew a gold pocket watch, clicking the cover open with a sharp snap. He studied the dial with exaggerated slowness, as if the seconds Octavius spent in his presence were a tax he was reluctantly paying. 10 minutes past 4, Cassian said, his voice a polished blade, dripping with a forced politeness more insulting than an open slur. A curious hour for a tradesman to be wandering. One would think you'd be occupied with the counting of pennies or the dusting of dead men's thoughts. Octavius stopped, his feet rooting to the damp stone. He felt the suffocating weight of his own insignificance. The shadow of the boy mocked for ink-stained fingers. He adjusted his glasses. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thorne Windsor. I was merely taking a moment to appreciate the evening air." Cassian let out a soft, thin sound that might have been a laugh. He looked past Octavius, sweeping the storefront of the bookshop with profound distaste. "The air is sufficient, Vance, but the view is lacking. I noticed as I rode past that your exterior has become cluttered, a collection of haphazard signs and crates. It is a smudge upon the aesthetic harmony of the village. Oakhaven is a place of curated beauty, not a warehouse for the discarded remnants of the printing press." "The shop is a place of learning, not a gallery," Octavius replied, his voice gaining a rhythmic steadiness. "I believe the villagers find the accessibility of the volumes more pressing than the symmetry of the signage." Cassian's eyes narrowed, the pupils contracting. He leaned forward in the saddle, the stallion shifting with a restless toss of its head. The movement brought the scent of expensive pomade and horsehair into the space between them. "You misunderstand your position, Vance. You speak of the villagers as if you were one of them, rather than a guest permitted to dwell within their borders. You are a curator of curiosities, perhaps, but let us not mistake a lease for ownership." Octavius felt a flash of heat rise in his neck. "My lease is legally binding, and my business is a lawful addition to this community." Law is a flexible thing, Cassian murmured. He checked his watch again, a punctuation mark of boredom. The land upon which your little fortress sits is subject to the whims of those who hold the deeds to the valley. It would be a tragedy if a sudden change in zoning, or a reclamation of ancestral boundaries, were to render your investment redundant. I should hate to see you forced back into the colonies with nothing but damp books to your name. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the casualness of a man discussing the weather. Octavius stood frozen, the social chasm between them yawning open. To Cassian, he was not a man, nor even a rival. He was an inconvenience, a piece of grit in a well-oiled machine. The power dynamic was absolute, rooted in soil and titles passed down through blood and greed. Cassian gave a curt nod. Do try to tidy your doorstep, Vance. It would be an improvement for us all. With a sharp tug of the reins, he pivoted the horse and rode away, the hooves striking the cobblestones with a mocking cadence. Octavius exhaled a long, shuddering breath. He looked down at his sleeve to brush away a stray piece of lint, and stopped. There, clinging to the dark wool of his cuff, was a small, crushed fragment of a pale petal. In his haste to leave the shop, a piece of the night bloom scent had caught on his sleeve, a vivid white streak against the drab fabric. A cold dread settled in his stomach. He remembered the predatory precision of Cassian's gaze. Cassian had not just looked at him, he had catalogued him. He had seen the flower, a symbol of secret intimacy, a breach of the social wall Octavius had spent years building. He watched the midnight blue coat disappear into the mist. The flower was a small thing, but in the rigid world of Oakhaven it was a confession. Octavius realized with a jolt of terror that the sanctuary he had built for himself and his daughter was no longer private. The secret was not just out. It was in the hands of a man who viewed vulnerability as an invitation for conquest. Chapter 4. The Keats volume felt heavy in Beatrix's hands, the vellum cover cool and slightly textured, like the skin of a dormant seed. She had retreated to the solitude of her morning room, where the scent of damp earth and citrus clung to the air, but her mind remained anchored in the dim, cedar-scented aisles of Octavius's shop. With a breath that tasted of peppermint tea, she opened the book to the marked page. There it was, a single, pressed specimen of night bloom scent. Its pale, translucent petals were frozen in a state of permanent surrender, a ghostly white streak against the cream paper. Beatrix felt a sudden, sharp electricity jump from the page to her fingertips. She began to tap a rhythmic, frantic beat against the cover, her nails clicking against the leather in time with a heart that had forgotten how to be still. It was more than a gesture of friendship. It was a cipher. Octavius, a man who treated silence as a sanctuary and words as precious currency, had spoken in the only language they both trusted. He had reached across the widening chasm of their social stations with a botanical confession, and the boldness of it made her dizzy. She leaned back into her velvet chair, the fabric scratching against her silk sleeves, and stared at the ceiling's ornate plasterwork, wondering if she had imagined the warmth in his gaze before he had looked away. By mid-afternoon, the light in the conservatory had turned a heavy honeyed gold, illuminating the floating dust motes that danced around her specimen jars. Beatrix moved among the ferns and orchids with a focused intensity, her skirts brushing against the terracotta pots. She bypassed the roses and the lilies, seeking something more clandestine. She stopped before a cluster of deep crimson blooms, their scent heady and thick, almost oppressive in the humidity of the glass house. With a pair of silver shears, she carefully excised a single petal. In the rigid lexicon of floriography, this specific hue and curve signified secret love, a declaration that was not merely romantic, but perilous. To send it was to invite a storm, yet as she pressed the petal into a small piece of parchment, the risk felt like the only thing making her feel alive. Returning to the village required a strategic masquerade. She draped a simple shawl over her shoulders to diminish the brilliance of her gown, though her movements remained airy, an unconscious lightness in her step that betrayed her composure. As she approached the bookshop, the sight of the weathered sign swinging in the breeze sent a tremor through her. She paused at the threshold, the bell above the door chiming with a sudden jarring clarity as she stepped inside. The shop smelled of old ink, beeswax, and the lingering sharp tang of a rainy afternoon. Octavius was behind the counter, his glasses perched precariously on the bridge of his nose as he examined a ledger. He did not look up immediately, but Beatrix noticed the way his hand tightened around the pen, the knuckles whitening. She approached him, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug that looked as though it had been stepped on by a century of scholars. She did not speak. The silence between them was a living thing, taut and vibrating like a plucked string. "I found the volume most illuminating, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice trailing off into a soft, thoughtful pause. He looked up then, his expression a mask of disciplined neutrality, though his eyes searched hers with a hunger he couldn't quite suppress. Beatrix slid the Keats volume across the polished mahogany counter. As she did, she shifted the book just a fraction of an inch, ensuring the red petal was visible for a heartbeat, a vivid, bleeding slash of color against the pale vellum. It was a daring, silent invitation, a bridge thrown across a void. For a second, Octavius froze. His gaze locked onto the petal, and Beatrix saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. The power in the room shifted. The tradesman was no longer merely a curator of books, and the lady was no longer merely a patron. They were conspirators in a language that required no subtitles. "Your promptness is appreciated, Miss Moreau," Octavius replied, his voice precise and low, though he did not move to close the book. He kept the petal in view, as if afraid that blinking would make the evidence of her affection vanish. From the periphery of the room, near a shelf of leather-bound botanical journals, Meilin Zhao watched the exchange. She had been standing there in a stillness that was almost clinical, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her dark eyes tracking every micro-expression. Meilin did not blink. She observed the slide of the book and the widening of Octavius's pupils with the detached interest of a biologist studying a rare specimen. To Meilin, the romantic tension was an interesting variable, but the social architecture of the room was far more concerning. She saw the vulnerability in Octavius's posture, the way he had momentarily forgotten to brush the dust from his sleeve, and the reckless hope in Beatrix's tilt of the head. As Beatrix turned to exit, her heart still drumming a frantic rhythm, Meilin stepped into her path. The movement was sudden but graceful, blocking the doorway with a pragmatic efficiency. Meilin's expression was unreadable, but her voice was a cool splash of water on a fever. "A bold choice of flora, Miss Moreau," Meilin said, her voice direct, stripping away the polite veneers of the ton. Beatrix blinked, her composure faltering. "I am unsure what you mean, Miss Zhao." "I mean that in my experience, the English aristocracy views such games not as romance, but as social suicide," Meilin replied, her gaze unwavering. "You are playing with a fire that does not merely burn the skin, it incinerates reputations." To signal such intimacy to a man of Mr. Frenchin, Vance's standing is to hand the world a weapon to use against you both. Beatrix felt a flush of irritation rise to her cheeks. She straightened her posture, attempting to reclaim her dignity. "You overstate the danger. It was a mere gesture of intellectual appreciation. Surely the world does not scrutinize a flower with such malice." Meilin did not smile, but there was a sharp, dry edge to her tone. "The world does not, but specific men do." She tilted her head slightly toward the window, her eyes narrowing. "For instance, the gentleman in the midnight blue carriage who has been stationed across the street for the last 20 minutes. He has not moved an inch since you entered the shop." Beatrix felt the blood drain from her face. She turned slowly, glancing through the glass pane of the shop window. There, framed by the gray mist of the afternoon, was the stark silhouette of Cassian Thorne Windsor. He was leaning back in his carriage, his posture stiff and predatory, his gaze fixed intently on the door. He had not seen the petal. It was impossible from that distance. But he had seen the lingering, the hesitation, and the unmistakable intimacy of the moment. He had seen the crack in the armor. Beatrix stepped back from the window, a cold shudder running through her. She had intended to signal her heart to the man she admired, but in doing so, she had signaled her vulnerability to the man who sought to own her. The shop, which had felt like a sanctuary moments ago, suddenly felt like a glass cage, and the predator was merely waiting for the right moment to strike. Chapter 5. Chapter title: The Price of Prestige. The assembly room of the village hall smelled of beeswax, expensive French powder, and 100 lilies forced to bloom out of season. Octavius stood at the edge of the dance floor, his back against a mahogany pillar, the only solid thing in a room spinning with silk and judgment. He brushed a microscopic speck of dust from his sleeve, a phantom ritual of order in a place where he felt fundamentally disordered. Around him, the gentry moved in practiced gliding circles. The women were visions of high-waisted muslin, their laughter sounding like the delicate, brittle chime of crystal. Octavius adjusted his gold-framed glasses. He had dressed with meticulous care, his charcoal coat whispering of scholarship, but in this sea of peacock blues and shimmering golds, he felt as though he were wearing a shroud. He was not a guest so much as a specimen, a man who had returned from the colonies with a passion for the printed word and the audacity to call it a profession. At the center of the room, the orbit shifted. Cassian Thorne Windsor had claimed the floor, his posture so rigid he seemed carved from the hall's own marble. He held a glass of champagne with predatory grace, his gaze sweeping the room until it locked onto Octavius. A thin smile curved his lips, the kind a cat reserves for a slow mouse. Cassian raised his voice, ensuring the surrounding circle leaned in for the feast. "I have recently discovered a most peculiar fascination with the scent of old ink," Cassian began, his voice dripping with honeyed politeness. "A heavy, cloying aroma, is it not? Quite unlike the freshness of a well-managed estate. It smells of damp cellars and the desperate clinging to things the world has long since forgotten. I find it curious that some among us still insist on dwelling in the musty shadows of the trade counter, treating the sale of paper as if it were a sacred right of the priesthood." A ripple of polite, cruel laughter cascaded through the crowd, a collective agreement that the boundary between the landed gentry and the merchant class was a wall of nature. Octavius felt the heat climb his neck. His fingers tightened around the edge of his coat. He wanted to defend the nobility of the archive, but the words felt like stones in his mouth. "Indeed, Cassian," a nearby baronet chimed in. "One wonders if the ink eventually stains the soul. A man who spends his days weighing pennies against pages must surely lose the capacity for true leisure." Cassian's eyes never left Octavius. "That is the tragedy, the delusion that one can curate society from the periphery. One does not enter the circle by selling the books that describe it. One enters by owning the land upon which the circle is drawn. To mistake the map for the territory is a scholarly error and a social catastrophe." The fragrance of the lilies became cloying, almost metal-sharp, and the laughter sounded like a blade scraping a plate. A hot surge of indignation rose in Octavius. He shifted his weight, his boots clicking sharply on the polished floor. He imagined the words, "Your prestige is a mask for a vacuum of intellect." Across the room, Beatrix Moreau had frozen. Her fan stopped its rhythmic flutter, and her eyes locked onto his with a mixture of horror and empathy. She took a half-step forward, her lips parting to launch a defense. But the sharp snap of her chaperone's fan closing sounded like a pistol shot. A firm hand clamped onto Beatrix's elbow, pulling her back. The chaperone's look was an absolute warning. Do not descend into the mud with the tradesman. Beatrix's gaze lingered for a heartbeat longer, a silent, desperate communication, before she was forced to turn away. The loss of her support felt like the extinguishing of a candle in a drafty room. He was alone in the light, exposed. Surprisingly, the laughter began to fade. Bramwell Finch, leaning precariously against a sideboard with a glass of punch, stopped chuckling. He watched Octavius, not with mockery, but with a tilting curiosity. He noticed the trembling jaw and the white-knuckled grip, but above all, the frozen dignity of the silence. Bramwell recognized the raw strength of a man who refused to beg for a place in a room that hated him. Now, Cassian," Bramwell remarked, his melodic voice cutting through the tension. "Surely we can admire the dedication. Not many of us have the patience for such dusty endeavors. It is almost heroic, in a quaint sort of way." Cassian didn't look at Bramwell. He stepped closer to Octavius, invading his space with a deliberate encroachment. The smell of expensive tobacco and arrogance clung to him. "Heroism requires a cause, Mr. Vance, not a ledger. A man of trade should be grateful for the crumbs of society's attention, rather than attempting to curate its tastes. Be careful that you do not mistake tolerance for acceptance." The indignation had cooled into a hard knot of resolve. Octavius did not offer a retort. To do so would be to acknowledge that Cassian's opinion held weight. Instead, he simply turned. He walked away from the center of the room, through the parting sea of silk, his pace steady despite the drumming of his heart. He did not look back at Beatrix, nor at the smug satisfaction on Cassian's face. As he pushed through the heavy oak doors into the cool, damp evening, the silence felt like a benediction. He reached into his pocket for his handkerchief, but his fingers brushed a piece of parchment he didn't recognize. He pulled it out. It was not a poem. The paper was heavy, official vellum, bearing the stark black seal of the local magistrate. Octavius unfolded it, his eyes scanning the clipped calligraphy. His breath hitched. It was a summons regarding the legality of his business license and a notice of a pending inquiry into the zoning of his premises, a direct attack on the existence of his sanctuary. He looked back at the glowing windows of the hall where the music was still playing, and he knew the summons had not been a coincidence. He could almost hear Cassian's voice echoing in the wind. "I told you, Vance, that I own the land upon which you stand." Chapter 6. Chapter title, Shields of Silk. The gravel of the south terrace crunched beneath Beatrix's slippers, a sound like grinding bone in the heavy stillness of the afternoon. She stopped before Mei Lin Zhao, who stood by the koi pond, observing an iridescent fish with a concentration that suggested a scientific audit. Beatrix's breath came in shallow bursts that ruffled the lace of her bodice. "Mei Lin, I beg of you, look at me," Beatrix said, her voice trembling. "I cannot endure another evening of the assembly. I cannot endure Cassian's gaze, nor the way he speaks of my future as if it were a ledger he had already balanced. I feel as though I am being slowly entombed in silk and propriety." Mei Lin waited for the ripple in the water to settle before shifting her gaze. Her dark eyes were pragmatic, devoid of the romantic haze that clouded the conversations of the local ladies. "You are asking for a conspiracy, Beatrix. To shield a woman of your standing invites the scrutiny of the entire household, and I have spent my tenure here cultivating a very specific kind of invisibility." "Precisely why you are the only one who can do it," Beatrix countered. "The diplomat's daughter, the visiting scholar, your presence is an ornament of state. If you insist on my company for botanical studies or translation, my mother would see it as an educational pursuit. She would not suspect I am merely seeking air. Please, I cannot breathe in that house." Mei Lin let out a soft, dry sound. She studied Beatrix, the flushed cheeks, the desperate tilt of the head, and saw not a flighty girl but a woman fighting for the remnants of her own mind. "Very well. But we shall not rely on mere excuses. Those are too easily dismantled. We require a system, a language that exists beneath the notice of the Ton." They spent the next hour huddled in the shadow of a weeping willow. Mei Lin's mind worked with geometric precision. They devised a series of signals. A blue ribbon tied to the left wrist indicated the coast was clear. A fan held closed against the chin meant an eye was watching. There was a tactical map drawn in silk and ivory, a way to navigate the drawing room without triggering a scandal. For Beatrix, it felt like the first real weapon she had ever been handed. 2 days later, the blue ribbon was tight against her skin. Beatrix slipped away from the tea service, her heart drumming against her ribs. She skirted the manicured lawns until she reached the dense, aromatic wall of the night bloom scent garden. Behind a towering hedge of privet, Octavius was waiting. He looked as though he had not slept. The precision of his waistcoat was marred by misaligned buttons, and his eyes were shadowed. He stood with his hands clasped tightly behind his back, his silhouette rigid. The silence between them was no longer a comfortable hush. It was a taut wire. "Octavius," she whispered. "You should not be here, Beatrix," he said, his voice clipped and utilitarian, like a man reciting a legal brief. "The risks have escalated. The summons I received is not a mere formality, it is a calculated strike. Cassian does not intend to simply displace me. He intends to erase the notion that a man of my standing can exist in this village on his own terms." "Then we fight him," Beatrix insisted. "There must be a way to contest the zoning, some precedent in the law. You cannot succumb to his arrogance." Octavius turned his head, his glasses catching a sliver of sun. "Fighting him is a luxury for those who have nothing to lose but pride. I have a daughter. I have a legacy of scholarship that cannot survive a public scandal. If I am dragged through the mud of a magistrate's court, I become a liability to everyone I touch, including you." Beatrix stepped forward, smelling the old paper and ink that always clung to him, mixed now with a sharp tang of anxiety. She reached out, her fingers grazing the wool of his sleeve. Octavius flinched. He stepped back with a suddenness that was almost violent, his arm jerking away as if her touch had been a hot coal. Beatrix froze. The rejection was a sudden wall of ice. Octavius looked at her, and for a moment the mask slipped. She saw a profound, shimmering terror, not of Cassian, but of the possibility of wanting something he could not protect. He was retreating into the fortress of his own repression to save them both from the fallout. "The distance is the only thing that is safe," he murmured. "Please return to the house." "And leave you to face this alone?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I will not be a silent observer to your ruin." "You are already a participant in a dangerous game, Miss Moreau," a commanding voice cut through the greenery. They both jumped. Vespera Okoro stood at the edge of the veranda, framed by white columns. Her fingers were steepled beneath her chin, her gaze evaluating them with the precision of a general surveying a flawed defensive line. Beatrix felt the blood drain from her face. "Vespera, we were merely discussing botany." "Do not insult my intelligence with the language of flowers, child," Vespera said. She stepped off the veranda, the gravel crunching rhythmically under her boots. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes shifting from Octavius's rigid form to Beatrix's panic. The Taun's gaze is more piercing than a needle. You believe you are hiding behind hedges and blue ribbons, but you are merely dancing in a spotlight you cannot see. Octavius cleared his throat. I apologize for the intrusion upon the estate's peace, Mrs. Okoro. Vespera ignored him, her focus remaining on Beatrix. You think you are the architect of your own secrecy, but you are merely a guest in a house of glass. You should know that there are those who find your absences illuminating. Someone has been paying the village gossips a handsome sum to report every single visitor who crosses the threshold of that bookshop. Chapter 7. The first drop struck Octavius squarely between the eyes, a heavy, cold bullet of water that shattered the oppressive humidity of the afternoon. He didn't move at first, his boots sinking into the soft loam of the garden path, but the sky had already turned the color of a bruised plum. Beside him, Beatrix gasped, her hand flying to the lace collar of her gown as the clouds finally split open. It was not a gradual onset. It was a deluge, a sudden, violent erasure of the world that turned the meticulously manicured hedges into blurred charcoal lines and the gravel paths into rushing rivers of gray silt. "The portico!" Octavius shouted, his voice nearly swallowed by a sudden roar of thunder that shook the very ground beneath them. He reached for her, his fingers brushing the damp silk of her sleeve, and guided her with a frantic urgency toward the narrow stone overhang of the old garden wall. They scrambled beneath the shelter just as the rain transitioned from a downpour to a blinding sheet of white, the sound of it drumming against the stone with a deafening, rhythmic violence. They came to a halt in a space no wider than a coffin. The portico was a remnant of a previous century, a sliver of granite that offered a meager sanctuary against the storm. Because the space was so confined, they were forced into a proximity that would have been scandalous in any other light. Octavius could feel the heat radiating from her shoulder. He could smell the sharp, static crackle scent of the rain mixed with the lingering, honeyed fragrance of the night bloom scent she wore. He stood rigid, his breath coming in short, jagged bursts, his arm pressed firmly against hers. The dampness of her gown had made the fabric cling to her frame, and the sudden chill of the air made her shiver violently. Beatrix leaned back against the cold stone, her chest heaving. Water dripped from the stray curls of her hair, tracing glistening paths down her pale cheeks and disappearing into the neckline of her dress. She fixed on him, and for the first time the polished mask of the gentry had been washed away. There was no poise left, no curated distance. She looked raw, frightened, and profoundly present. "We are quite ruined," she whispered, a small, breathless laugh escaping her. She looked down at her hem, which was now saturated with mud and grit. "My father will think I have been swimming in the pond." Octavius did not laugh. He studied her, really looked at her, and felt the fortress he had built around his heart begin to crumble under the weight of the storm. The rain had stripped away the labels of tradesman and lady, leaving only two people shivering in the dark. He felt a sudden, visceral ache in his throat, a pressure that made it difficult to swallow. For years he had used the language of scholarship and the distance of propriety as a shield, believing that if he remained a ghost in his own life, he could protect those he loved from the wreckage of his own failures. "I cannot do this any more," he said. His voice was different. The archaic rhythms and the carefully chosen syllables were gone, replaced by a broken, honest rasp. He stepped closer, closing the final inch of space until his chest nearly touched hers. "This silence, Beatrix, I thought it was a shield. I told myself that by staying distant I was keeping you safe from the opinions of men like Thorne Windsor. But it is not a shield. It is a prison. I have locked myself in a cell of my own making, and I am suffocating in the dark." Beatrix froze, her eyes widening. The air between them became electric, thick with a tension that felt more powerful than the thunder rolling overhead. She didn't pull away. Instead, she tilted her head back, her gaze searching his face with an intensity that made him feel completely exposed. "Then break the lock, Octavius," she breathed. Her voice was a fragile thread, barely audible over the rain. He reached out, his hand trembling. He didn't touch her skin, not yet, but his fingers hovered just beside her jaw, the warmth of his palm fighting the damp chill of the air. He could see the pulse fluttering in the hollow of her throat, a rapid, rhythmic drumming that mirrored his own. He leaned in, his forehead almost touching hers, their breath mingling in the humid gray air. The world outside the portico ceased to exist. There was no village, no social rank, no predatory landowners. There was only the scent of wet stone and the terrifying, shimmering possibility of a second chance. Just as the gap between them vanished, just as the gravity of years of longing threatened to pull them into a collision, a sharp, rhythmic sound cut through the rain. At the edge of the portico, framed by the curtain of water, stood Vespera Okoro. She held a wide, black silk umbrella that shielded her from the deluge, her expression as inscrutable as a sphinx. She had been watching them, her gaze steady and piercing, evaluating the scene with the precision of a judge. Octavius jumped back, the sudden movement almost sending him stumbling into the rain. He instinctively brushed at his sleeve, the old habit returning even in the face of total emotional collapse. Beatrix gasped, clutching her shawl around her shoulders, her face flushing a deep crimson. She watched Vespera with a mixture of terror and guilt, expecting a lecture on the impropriety of their position, a reminder of the gaze of the Ton, or a command to return to the manor immediately. Vespera did not speak. She looked at Octavius, at his disheveled hair, his damp coat, and the raw vulnerability written across his features. Then she studied Beatrix. Slowly, with a deliberation that felt like a royal decree, Vespera gave a single, slow nod of approval. It was a silent benediction, a recognition that some things were more vital than the rules of the drawing room. Without a word, she stepped back into the rain, her figure receding into the gray mist, leaving them in a sudden, echoing silence. The silence lasted only a few heartbeats. From the direction of the main road, the sound of galloping hooves splashed through the mud, loud and frantic. A messenger, drenched to the bone and splattered with filth from his boots to his waistcoat, slid to a halt before the portico. He was panting, his breath coming in ragged plumes of steam in the cooling air. "Miss Moreau," the man shouted, his voice cracking. He reached into his coat and produced a letter, the parchment protected by a wax-sealed leather sleeve. "A summons from your father. Immediate, miss. He requires your presence at the manor this instant." Beatrix took the letter, her fingers shaking so violently that the parchment rattled. She didn't open it immediately, but the urgency in the messenger's eyes and the formal seal of the house told her everything she needed to know. The bubble had burst. The storm had washed away the pretense of their secret, and now the world was calling her back to a place where Octavius could not follow. She looked at Octavius, the hope that had sparked between them moments ago now clouded by a sudden, chilling dread. The letter felt heavy in her hand, a leaden weight that threatened to pull her back into the rigid architecture of her father's expectations. Octavius reached for her hand, but the messenger shifted his weight, clearing his throat with a loud, impatient sound, reminding them both that time and propriety had returned with a vengeance. Chapter 8. The carriage door had barely clicked shut before Beatrix collapsed into the foyer of the bookshop, her breath hitching in a jagged, audible sob. She did not wait for Octavius to speak, nor did she observe the customary pause for greeting. She simply leaned against the mahogany counter, the silk of her pale lavender gown snagging on a stray splinter of wood. Her eyes were rimmed with a violent red, and the letter from her father remained clenched in her hand, the parchment now a crumpled, sweat-stained ruin. "He has given me until the fortnight's end," she whispered, her voice thin and brittle like dried parchment. "Accept Cassian's hand or be cast out. Not a farthing, Octavius. Not a single gown, nor a book, nor a roof over my head. He spoke of it as a mercy to spare me the indignity of a slow decline into poverty." Octavius felt the air leave his lungs. He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from her shoulder, paralyzed by the sudden, crushing weight of the social chasm between them. He wanted to pull her into the sanctuary of the back room, away from the drafty entrance, but the sheer brutality of the ultimatum left him frozen. To be a tradesman was a quiet burden. To be the catalyst for a woman's exile was a catastrophe. "The man is a monster," Octavius said, his voice low and precise, though the rhythm was disrupted by a tremor. "He is a creditor," Beatrix replied, finally looking up. Her expression was not one of defeat, but of a cold, hard clarity that terrified him. "My father does not see a daughter. He sees a liability that can be liquidated. Cassian knows this. He isn't courting me, Octavius. He is acquiring me." Their moment of shared grief was severed by the chime of the bell. The door swung open with a violence that rattled the window-panes, admitting a gust of damp air and the unmistakable, oppressive presence of Cassian Thorne Windsor. He did not enter so much as he occupied the space, his spine a rigid line of arrogance, his polished boots clicking with predatory precision on the floorboards. He ignored Beatrix entirely, his gaze sliding over her as if she were a piece of furniture he had already purchased. Cassian produced a heavy vellum document from his coat, snapping it open with a crisp, authoritative sound. He laid it upon the counter, sliding it toward Octavius with a single, manicured finger. "A technicality of land use, Vance," Cassian said, his voice dripping with a forced, oily politeness. "It appears the deed for this particular plot was never properly amended for commercial trade following the estate's partition." As the primary landowner of the surrounding acreage, I find the presence of a bookshop to be an unsightly irregularity. This is a formal notice of intent to revoke your business license. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises before the magistrate declares the structure a public nuisance. Octavius looked at the document, then at the man. The malice was no longer veiled. It was naked. A calculated strike designed to strip Octavius of the one thing he had built for his daughter's future. Cassian leaned in, his voice dropping to a cutting whisper. You are a smudge on the prestige of this village, Vance. I shall enjoy watching you scrub yourself from the map. When the door finally closed behind Cassian, the silence that followed was heavier than the rain. Beatrix left shortly after, her departure a blur of whispered promises and a lingering, desperate touch of the hand. Octavius did not follow her. He could not. He sank into the darkness of the shop as the evening shadows lengthened, the scent of old leather and binding glue suddenly feeling suffocating. He spent hours in the gloom, the oil lamp flickering low, casting dancing ghosts against the shelves of Keats and Virgil. He wandered through the aisles, his fingers brushing the spines of rare manuscripts, but the vellum no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a tomb. If he fought Cassian, he risked accelerating Beatrix's ruin. If he surrendered, he lost his soul. He sat at his desk, the silence of the shop amplifying the roar of his own inadequacy. He contemplated the logistics of departure, the crates, the sale of the stock, the quiet retreat into a life of anonymity where he would never have to see the light in Beatrix's eyes dim because of him. You look like a man awaiting the guillotine, a voice remarked from the doorway. Octavius started, his glasses sliding down his nose. Bramwell Finch stood there, leaning precariously against the doorframe. He wasn't wearing his usual smirk, nor was he punctuating his presence with a loud laugh. In his hand he carried a leather folder, his expression uncharacteristically grim. I have no appetite for jests, Bramwell, Octavius said, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. Good, because I've brought something far more interesting than a joke, Bramwell replied. He stepped forward and dumped a series of documents onto the desk, overlapping the legal threat Cassian had left. I may be a hedonist, Vance, but I am a hedonist with an appetite for the archives. While looking for some old maps of the hunting grounds, I stumbled upon the Thorne Windsor land deeds. It seems our dear Cassian has been playing a dangerous game with the Crown's excise taxes on his timber holdings. He hasn't just been skimming, he's been fabricating. Octavius frowned, scanning the pages. Why tell me this? Because Cassian is a bore, Bramwell said, though his eyes remained serious. And because he is far more desperate for Beatrix's dowry than he pretends. He isn't seeking a wife for companionship, he's seeking a capital injection to cover a yawning hole in his accounts. If he doesn't marry her soon, the Crown will be the one revoking his licenses. The revelation acted as a spark in the dark. The despair didn't vanish, but it shifted into a cold academic focus. Octavius felt a strange, humming energy return to his limbs. He was no longer a victim of a landslide, he was a strategist in a war of papers. 2 days later, a discreet visitor arrived, Mei Lin Zhao. She entered the shop with her usual pragmatic grace, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she sat across from him. She produced a stack of letters, the ink fresh and the calligraphy impeccable. These are forged, Mei Lin stated plainly, her eyes unwavering. They are scholarly correspondences from the Royal Botanical Society, requesting Beatrix's urgent assistance in translating several pharmaceutical texts on night-blooming flora. They are dated, stamped, and look entirely authentic. Your lady may now visit this shop under the guise of urgent research. Her father will not question the academic merit of such a pursuit, provided the letters look official enough to frighten him. Octavius felt a surge of gratitude for the woman's clinical efficiency. I cannot thank you enough, Mei Lin. Don't thank me. Just ensure you use the information Bramwell provided effectively, she replied, rising to leave. The window of opportunity in these matters is usually quite small. Octavius turned back to his desk, his mind already weaving the counterstrike. He began to draft a letter to the magistrate, citing the irregularities in Cassian's deeds as a reason to stay the eviction. He felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that he could carve out a space for himself and Beatrix in this rigid world. That hope was shattered when a second messenger arrived, breathless and shivering, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. He handed Octavius a formal summons. Octavius opened it, his heart sinking as he read the elegant, cruel script. Cassian had not waited for the 72 hours. He had leveraged his influence with the local court to move the proceedings forward. The hearing for the revocation of the shop's license was not in a week, nor in 3 days. It was scheduled for tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Chapter 9. The village square had been transformed into a battlefield of petals and prestige. Silk awnings in pale primrose and mint green stretched across the cobblestones, casting a filtered light over the assembled gentry of the town, who moved in a slow, predatory glide. It was the seasonal flower show, an event where the competition was less about the botany and more about the sheer expense of the imports. Women in empire waist gowns of watered silk carried lace parasols like shields, their eyes scanning for any slip in decorum, while the men stood in stiff clusters discussing acreage and excise taxes with the rhythmic boredom of the landed class. Octavius Vance did not arrive with a cart of leather-bound volumes or a modest display of seedlings. He arrived with a wagon that groaned under the weight of a singular, massive installation. As the laborers helped him slide the structure into the center of the square, a hush rippled through the crowd. It was not the curated, symmetrical perfection of the other displays. It was a wild, towering architecture of flora that seemed to breathe and surge upward, defying the rigid geometry of the surrounding booths. It was an eruption of nature in a place that preferred its nature pruned into submission. At the base, the arrangement was anchored by heavy, deep crimson roses, their scent thick and intoxicating. Interwoven through the center were stark, ivory-white lilies, their trumpets flared open in a silent shout. But it was the crowning element that caused the first audible gasp. Thick clusters of night bloom scent, their pale, ethereal blossoms shimmering with a ghostly luminescence that should have been impossible in the midday sun. In the secret language of floriography, the combination was not a mere decoration. It was a manifesto. The red roses spoke of passion, the lilies of purity and longing. The night bloom scent was the signature of a shared, hidden world. Together, they formed a public confession of love so explicit it was practically an invitation to scandal. "Good heavens," a woman murmured, her fan snapping shut with the sound of a pistol shot. "Is he quite mad?" Octavius stood beside his creation, his fingers grazing the rough wool of his coat. He did not adjust his glasses, he did not brush the dust from his sleeves. For the first time in a decade, the internal machinery of repression, the careful curation of his every word and gesture, had ceased to function. He felt a strange, humming lightness in his chest, as if he had finally stepped out of a heavy cloak he had worn since childhood. Cassian Thorne Windsor approached, his posture so upright he seemed carved from a single piece of mahogany. He stopped 3 feet from the arrangement, his gaze flickering from the flowers to Octavius with a look of profound distaste. He checked his pocket watch, a gesture of calculated impatience. "Vance," Cassian said, his voice dripping with a forced, oily politeness. "I was unaware that the local nursery had begun specializing in the grotesque. Tell me, did you find this particular arrangement in a guidebook for the delirious, or did you simply forget the basic principles of symmetry?" It is an eyesore, a vulgar, loud display that clashes quite violently with the dignity of the square. Octavius looked at him. He didn't see the powerful landowner or the threat to his lease. He saw a man who lived in a house of mirrors, terrified that a single crack might reveal the emptiness behind the glass. "I have spent my life calculating the distance between my heart and my tongue," Octavius thought, the realization spiking through him like a fever. "I have played the part of the quiet scholar, the invisible man, the ghost in the library. I have waited for a permission that will never come from men like him. Why should I seek a seat at a table where the food is ash and the conversation is a lie? Let the bridges burn. Let the smoke signal the end of my silence." "The symmetry you crave, Cassian, is the symmetry of the grave," Octavius replied, his voice ringing clear across the square, carrying further than he had ever permitted it to. "It is the beauty of things that have stopped growing. This arrangement is not intended to please the eye of a curator, but to speak a truth that cannot be contained in a ledger or a deed." Cassian's smile that stayed cold. "Truth? You speak of truth while standing in the middle of a public square with a bouquet that reads like a cheap romance novel. You have forgotten your place, Vance. You are a tradesman playing at being a poet. It is pathetic." "My place," Octavius said, stepping forward, his voice devoid of its usual hesitation, "is wherever I choose to stand. My worth is not measured in the acreage of my holdings or the antiquity of my title, but in the truth of my devotion. I would rather be a beggar with a heart that speaks than a lord who has forgotten how to feel." A collective intake of breath swept through the ton. The murmurings grew into a low roar of indignation. To challenge the social hierarchy so openly, to prioritize emotion over estate, was an act of social suicide. He could see the judges of the flower show whispering, their faces pinched in horror. He had not just broken a rule of decorum, he had committed a heresy of class. He had effectively exiled himself from the only society that granted a man legitimacy in this valley. He didn't care. He turned his gaze away from the sneering face of Cassian and looked toward the railing of the viewing platform. Beatrix was there. She stood between her father, whose face was a mask of thunderous disapproval, and Cassian's hovering presence. She looked as though she had been turned to marble. Her skin was a stark, translucent pale, and her hand, the one resting on the wrought iron railing, was trembling so violently that the lace of her cuff fluttered in the breeze. She wasn't looking at the crowd, nor at her father. She was staring at the night bloom scent, her eyes wide and glistening, reflecting the impossible light of the blossoms. Octavius felt a sudden, sharp fear, not of the scandal, but of the vulnerability he had just exposed. He had thrown his heart into the square like a challenge. He had stripped away every defense, every scholarly shield, and left himself open to the most devastating blow of all, her silence. As the crowd began to close in, the voices rising in a tide of judgment, Cassian leaned in toward Beatrix, his voice a low, possessive hiss. "Look at him, Beatrix, a madman. A commoner who thinks a few flowers can bridge the gap between a shop and a manor." Beatrix did not move. She did not blink. She simply stared at the red roses and the white lilies, and for a fleeting second her fingers tightened on the railing, not in fear, but as if she were trying to hold on to the earth before she was swept away by the current of Octavius's confession. Then her father's hand clamped firmly onto her shoulder, steering her away from the railing and back toward the safety of the shaded canopy, leaving Octavius alone in the center of the square with his beautiful ruinous garden. Chapter 10. The silence that followed Octavius's confession was not a void, but a weight, thick as the humidity before a summer storm. He stood in the center of the square, the scent of the night bloom blossoms clinging to his skin like a second, more honest layer of clothing. The crowd had frozen, a tableau of silk waistcoats and rigid corsets, their faces twisted in a collective grimace of social vertigo. Octavius did not look at them. He kept his gaze fixed on the space where Beatrix had been, the air still vibrating with the echo of his own voice. Cassian Thorne Windsor moved then, his boots clicking with a predatory precision against the cobblestones. He stepped into the gap, his posture a column of unyielding arrogance, and reached out a hand toward Beatrix. It was not an invitation so much as a claim, a physical manifestation of the lease, the land, and the lineage he believed entitled him to her. His fingers were manicured, the gold signet ring on his pinky catching the light, as he gestured for her to return to the shade of the canopy, away from the contagion of Octavius's sincerity. "Come, Beatrix," Cassian said, his voice a polished blade. "Let us leave this theater of the absurd. The spectacle has reached its zenith, and it would be a pity for your reputation to be further tarnished by association with a man who mistakes a garden for a manifesto." Beatrix did not move toward him. Instead, she stepped forward, moving out from under the canopy and into the unfiltered glare of the afternoon sun. The movement was slow, deliberate, the rustle of her pale muslin gown a soft friction against the sudden hush of the assembly. She stopped a few feet from Cassian, her head tilted slightly, her eyes no longer marble but liquid, searching. She watched the hand extended toward her, the hand that represented security, the ton, and a lifetime of curated silences, and then she studied Octavius. "You speak of reputation, Cassian, as if it were a garment one wears to keep out the cold," Beatrix said. Her voice was lyrical, carrying that airy quality that usually signaled a daydream, but now it possessed a sudden crystalline firmness. "But I find the fabric stifling. I have spent my life learning the language of flowers, because the language of people has become so dreadfully hollow." Cassian's smile didn't vanish, it simply curdled. A poetic sentiment, certainly, but poetry does not maintain an estate, nor does it provide a seat at the table of the gentry. "You are drifting, Beatrix. Allow me to ground you." "I would rather drift into the unknown than be anchored to a void," she replied. She turned her back on Cassian, a gesture of such profound social violence that several ladies in the crowd gasped, their fans snapping shut like small guillotines. She walked toward Octavius, her steps light but unwavering. When she stopped before him, she did not reach for his hand immediately. She looked up at him, her gaze tracing the lines of his face, the glasses slightly askew, the dust of the bookshop still lingering in the creases of his coat. "I choose the mind that understands the night bloom," she whispered, though in the vacuum of the square it sounded like a shout. I choose the heart that speaks the truth, even when the world demands a lie. I choose you, Octavius. Cassian's face contorted, the mask of the polished aristocrat slipping to reveal a raw, jagged narcissism. He stepped forward, his voice dropping to a hiss that carried across the silence. You are committing social suicide, Beatrix. You will be a pariah. You will be the joke of every drawing room from here to London. You would trade your station for a tradesman, for a man who sells ink and old paper. From the periphery of the crowd, a sudden melodic burst of laughter erupted. Bramwell Finch was leaning back precariously against a stone planter, his expansive hand waving in the air as if conducting a symphony. Oh, do shut up, Cassian. It is the most exciting thing to happen in this valley since the great frost of 12. Truly, the drama is exquisite. Beside him, Mei Lin Zhao did not laugh. She stood with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on Cassian with a cold, surgical detachment. She didn't say a word, but the unwavering intensity of her stare seemed to shrink the landowner, stripping away the perceived power of his title until he was merely a man shouting at a woman who no longer feared him. Beatrix's father, who had remained a statue of thunderous disapproval, finally moved. He studied his daughter, then at the shifting tide of the crowd, the curiosity replacing the horror, the quiet admiration beginning to ripple through the younger members of the ton. He saw the resolve in Beatrix's shoulders, a strength he had perhaps forgotten he had fostered. With a curt, reluctant nod, a gesture that was less a blessing and more a surrender to the inevitable, he stepped back, granting them the space they had claimed. Octavius felt the world rush back in, the smell of crushed grass, the distant chime of the village clock, the frantic beating of his own heart. He reached out, his fingers brushing her wrist, and then, with a sudden urgency that defied every rule of decorum they had ever known, he led her away. They retreated from the noise and the staring eyes, weaving through the hedgerows and slipping past the ornate gates into the sanctuary of the night-bloom garden. Here, the air was different. It was heavy with the intoxicating, creamy scent of night-bloom scent, and the secret perfume of the night-blooms, a fragrance that felt like a physical embrace. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in dappled gold coins, dancing across the mossy earth. As they reached the center of the glade, the silence changed. It was no longer a wait, but a sanctuary. Octavius turned to her, his breath hitching. For a moment they simply stood there, the tactile reality of their proximity outweighing the years of coded letters and pressed petals. Then, Beatrix leaned in, and he pulled her against him. The embrace was not the polished, distant hold of a Regency courtship. It was a collision. He could feel the rapid thrum of her pulse against his chest, the scratch of the lace on her gown against his palms, and the warmth of her breath against his neck. She clung to him, as if he were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. "I am a pariah now," she whispered into the wool of his coat, her voice trembling slightly. "I can feel it. The doors will close. The invitations will cease. I have stepped off the edge of the world, Octavius." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing a stray lock of hair. "The world we left behind was a gilded cage, Beatrix. It is a small price to pay for the air we are breathing now." They stood in silence for a long time, the fragrance of the night-bloom scent enveloping them like a shroud for their old lives. As they eventually turned to look back toward the village, the silhouette of the bookshop appeared in the distance, a modest building of brick and timber. It had always been a place for Octavius to hide, a fortress of solitude where he could curate the thoughts of dead men. But as he held Beatrix's hand, her fingers interlaced with his, he realized the sanctuary had changed. It was no longer a place to hide from the world, but the foundation upon which they would build a new one, a world where the only currency that mattered was the truth of a heart and the shared passion of a mind. Chapter 1. Kezia Thorne knelt upon the gravel path of her cottage garden, the rosemary stems yielding under her shears with a crisp snap that echoed the sea's distant rhythm. Salt thickened the air, carrying the faint brine of waves breaking beyond the dunes, while the low sun cast long shadows across the thyme borders. A sudden gust from the sea lifted the pages of her open book, sending them skittering toward the low boundary wall. She set the shears aside and rose, one hand still gripping the handle of her teacup as she followed the drifting paper. The cup's rim warmed her fingertips through the porcelain, a small steadiness amid the scattering leaves, and she wondered how long it had been since any object in her possession had felt so reliably her own. Her steps carried her closer to the hedge, boots crunching softly on the gravel. Through its thinning gaps the neighboring estate appeared, its ivy grown thick over the stone and its shutters drawn tight against the fading light. The structure stood larger than she had first supposed, its roofline broken by a single chimney that leaned slightly toward the sea, as though the building itself strained to hear the tide. Moss crept along the base of the wall, and the scent of damp earth rose with each breath she drew. She paused there, teacup steady, and let the quiet press against her thoughts. Solitude had drawn her to this cottage, yet the estate's neglected silhouette reminded her that boundaries, once crossed, rarely stayed intact. Beyond the wall a low voice muttered, deliberate and measured, as though weighing each word before release. She paused, her fingers tracing the teacup rim once, twice. The latch of a rusted gate resisted under unseen hands, metal grinding against metal in a sound that spoke of long disuse. Kezia's pulse slowed in the way it always did when she sensed another presence, careful, observant, unwilling to intrude until necessity demanded it. The voice belonged to a man, she judged, and carried the clipped cadence of someone accustomed to command yet choosing restraint. Earl Waleed Harrington stood with his shoulders angled away from the opening, one gloved hand working the mechanism. He did not look toward the cottage side. The gate gave a reluctant creak, wood straining against hinges swollen by years of sea air. Kezia watched the line of his coat, the way his posture held tension without release, and felt the familiar pull of curiosity she had long trained herself to ignore. "Good evening," Kezia called across the divide, her voice carrying the measured pauses that had served her well in former households. She kept her tone even, neither warm nor distant, a neutral bridge across the hedge. "The latch requires a lift before the turn. The salt air has warped the iron." Waleed Harrington did not turn fully. His head tilted only enough to acknowledge the words, the brim of his hat casting his profile into partial shadow. "Your observation is apt," he said, voice low. "I had not considered the angle of the hinge." The gate swung wider under his renewed pull, the metal protesting with a drawn-out groan that seemed to echo the weight of whatever errand had brought him here at dusk. Kezia remained on her side of the wall, the teacup still in hand. She watched the Earl's posture ease by a fraction, a subtle loosening of the shoulders that suggested her advice had landed. Gratitude surfaced in his next words, clipped yet sincere, as he thanked her for the instruction without further elaboration. "It functions now. You have my thanks." He spoke as though each syllable cost something, yet the sincerity beneath the brevity struck her as genuine rather than perfunctory. Evening light thinned across the garden. The lighthouse beam swept its first slow arc, catching the edge of a folded letter that had fallen near Waleed's boots. Kezia stooped for her recovered book and saw his silhouette framed against the estate wall, unmoving as the beam passed. She studied the rigid line of his back, the way his gloved fingers flexed once at his side before stilling again. The light carved sharp edges from the ivy and stone, then moved on, leaving him in deepening shadow. Inside her thoughts the moment stretched. Here was the solitude she had sought, already threaded by another's difficulty. She wondered whether the dropped letter concerned the estate's neglect or some newer trouble, and whether her greeting had been presumption or necessity. The rosemary scent still clung to her hands, sharp and green against the cooling air. The light returned on its circuit. Waleed's outline now revealed a second figure slipping away through the trees behind him, the shape indistinct yet purposeful in its retreat. Kezia's breath caught, her fingers tightened on the book cover. The figure moved with the quiet efficiency of someone practiced at avoidance, shoulders hunched, steps light on the carpet of fallen leaves. She could not discern height or clothing, only the sense of deliberate withdrawal, as though the meeting at the gate had been timed to end precisely when the beam swept past. Questions crowded her mind. Who had waited in the trees, and why had the Earl remained still rather than acknowledge the departure? Her own past had taught her the cost of noticing too much, yet the scene refused to release its hold. She considered calling out again, but held the impulse. The Earl remained still, his attention fixed upon the letter at his feet. The beam moved on, restoring shadow to the garden path. Kezia's grip on the teacup loosened by degrees, though the warmth had already bled from the porcelain. She traced the familiar curve of the handle with her thumb, grounding herself in the small, ordinary object, while the larger questions lingered unanswered. Waleed bent at last to retrieve the paper. He straightened without glancing toward her hedge, the letter disappearing into his coat pocket with a single economical motion. The second figure had vanished among the trees. leaving only the faint sound of retreating steps on dry leaves, barely audible, yet enough to confirm what the lighthouse had briefly shown. Kessia's thoughts circled the implications: an earl who met someone in secret at twilight, a dropped letter, a gate that yielded only after her intervention. None of it belonged to her, yet the boundary felt thinner than the hedge suggested. Kessia stepped back from the wall. The lighthouse beams swept once more, illuminating the empty space where the earl had stood. She carried her book and cup toward the cottage door, the question of the unseen departure lingering behind her. The gravel shifted beneath her boots with each measured stride, and the rosemary released its scent again as she brushed past the border. Inside the cottage, the fire would still be banked low, offering the uncomplicated quiet she had chosen, yet the evening's images refused to fade. The gate latch clicked shut. Walid's low voice did not rise again. Only the sea and the turning light remained to mark the boundary between their grounds, the beams sweeping onward as though it too had witnessed more than it would reveal. Chapter 2. Earl Walid Harrington tested the weight of the fallen gate with one shoulder angled outward, his boots planted on the gravel where the hinge had given way. The iron bars resisted his push, their rusted surface cold against the wool of his coat sleeve. A tray clinked behind him. Miss Kessia Thorne crossed the short distance from her cottage path, the china cup steady despite the uneven ground. "The light favors this hour for refreshment," she said, her voice even after the measured pause that always preceded her remarks. "Would you join me here at the wall?" Walid Harrington straightened, the motion deliberate, his shoulders already turning a fraction farther from her line of sight. He regarded the offered tray without immediate reply. Steam rose from the teapot, carrying the faint scent of bergamot over the rosemary border she had brushed past moments earlier. The invitation hung between them, neither accepted nor refused until his gloved hand lifted one cup. "Your kindness exceeds the occasion," he answered at last, settling onto the low stones without orienting his body toward hers. Kessia Thorne placed the tray between them on the flat top of the wall. She took her own seat, the fabric of her walking dress settling with a soft rustle that matched the distant rush of the tide. Her index finger found the porcelain rim of her cup and traced its curve once. "Tradesmen will arrive by the main drive tomorrow," she observed. "A chair placed at the correct angle spares both parties the awkwardness of a prolonged stand." The Earl's reply came low, each word spaced with care. "Such seating spares the estate further comment as well." The tea cooled between their cups, while the lighthouse beam completed another slow pass overhead, its edge catching the steam before it dispersed. He did not elaborate on the ledgers still stacked in the library, their pages marked only by the dust that gathered when no steward attended them. Kessia Thorne kept her hand still on the cup once the rim grew warm beneath her touch. Further questions would cross the boundary, the hedge already marked too thinly. Instead, she lifted the pot and refilled his cup, the liquid sound steady against the evening air. The beam flickered as clouds thinned above the tower, then steadied again. Walid Harrington mentioned the untended ledgers in the same low register, his attention fixed on the darkening lane beyond the wall. The admission carried no appeal for assistance, only the bare statement of a task deferred. Kessia Thorne offered no immediate counsel, her fingers resting now on the tablecloth edge rather than the porcelain. A rider's approach sounded first as the rhythmic strike of hooves on packed earth. Walid Harrington rose at once, the movement abrupt enough to shift the tray by a fraction. He did not reach for his cup again. The horse slowed at the boundary where the lane met the road, its rider's hat casting a shadow across his features before the figure turned the animal and continued without a word exchanged. The Earl remained standing, one hand still resting near the fallen gate. "Darius Harrington begins his market remarks at first light," he said. The words left the question of those remarks open between them, neither confirmed nor denied by the rider's silent passage. Kessia Thorne gathered the tray, her steps measured as she returned along the path where the rosemary released its scent once more. Inside the cottage the fire required no tending yet, but the evening's exchange lingered in the arrangement of the remaining cups. She set the tray on the sideboard and traced the handle of the last cup once before moving to the window. The gate remained visible from this angle, its iron bars now upright but still unlatched. The second figure from the previous twilight had not reappeared, though the possibility that it might return under cover of the next dusk pressed against the quiet she had sought. Walid Harrington walked the length of his own boundary wall before the rider's dust settled. The estate ledgers waited inside, their pages offering no counsel on the cousin whose visits always preceded fresh whispers among the neighboring landowners. He adjusted his coat once at the shoulder, the gesture habitual, then turned toward the house where no lamps had yet been lit in the public rooms. Kezia Thorne extinguished the single candle on the table, leaving the room in the soft half-light that filtered from the lighthouse beam. The invitation to tea had altered nothing in the formal sense, yet the writer's pause at the boundary suggested that formalities alone would not contain the matter. She placed the book she had carried earlier beside the tray and did not open it again that night. The following morning brought no further sign of the writer, only the sound of a cart approaching the main drive as the tradesmen arrived at the appointed hour. Waleed Harrington met them at the gate, the chair positioned as Miss Thorne had advised, his shoulders still angled away from any observer on the cottage side. The exchange lasted no longer than necessary, yet the presence of an additional witness at the boundary would have altered its tone entirely. Miss Halima Voss passed along the lane later with a basket of herbs, nodding once in acknowledgement when Kezia Thorne stepped outside. No words crossed the hedge, but the herbalist's direct glance carried the weight of shared understanding about the estate's visible neglect. The lighthouse beam continued its circuit, indifferent to the small adjustments of posture and speech that governed the ground between the two properties. Waleed Harrington returned the chair to its usual place inside the gate after the cart departed. The ledgers remained untouched for another hour while he considered the market remarks already in circulation. Darius Harrington's smooth delivery at such gatherings required no physical presence to achieve its effect, only the timing of a single writer's silent pause. Kezia Thorne resumed her reading by the window, the page turned only after the Earl's figure had withdrawn from view. The question of the dropped letter from the previous evening stayed unvoiced, as did the identity of the retreating figure among the trees. Both remained beyond the hedge, where the boundary still held, though the latch had been repaired. Chapter 3. Kezia Thorne reached for a bundle of rosemary at the edge of the herb stall, the vendor already wrapping the stems in coarse paper, when Halima Voss appeared at her elbow without ceremony. The market square held its usual press of baskets and aprons, the scent of fresh bread competing with the sharper tang of dried lavender from the next display. Sunlight filtered through the canvas awnings in dusty shafts, catching on the edges of metal tang coins and the weathered faces of villagers who paused too long between stalls. Kezia felt the weight of those glances even as she pretended otherwise. Halima's single sharp nod directed Kezia's attention toward the bread cart a few paces away, where the crowd thinned enough for private speech. They stepped aside together, Kezia adjusting the weight of her basket against one hip. Her fingers brushed the rough weave of the handle, grounding her as the hum of bartering voices swelled and receded around them. The Earl's accounts show no improvement, Halima said, her voice low, and carrying the faint cadence of her mother's country. She kept her eyes on the loaves, never quite meeting Kezia's. Tenants speak of letters that should not have left the study. One wonders how an outsider's name appears on documents meant for family eyes alone. Kezia's pulse quickened beneath the steady rhythm of market sounds, the creak of cartwheels, the clink of scales, the distant bark of a dog tied near the inn. She shifted her stance slightly, angling her body to shield their conversation from the herbalist behind them. Darius Harrington's voice rose from the adjoining stall, smooth as ever and edged with practiced solicitude. "One cannot help but note how quickly new faces alter the tone of a quiet estate," he remarked to the fishmonger, the words pitched to Carrie without seeming deliberate. "Particularly when those faces once held positions of trust in town households. A lighthouse keeper, they say, with connections that stretch farther than the beam itself." Kezia turned her head only slightly. She caught the flicker of Darius's profile, his polished boots planted wide, one hand gesturing as though the topic were mere idle talk, before she answered. "How far do such observations travel before the weekends, Mr. Harrington?" she asked, her tone even and carrying the small reflective pause that often followed her questions. Inside, doubt coiled tighter. Did he know about the writer already? Or was this another test to see what she would reveal? Halima's soft accent continued once the cousin moved on, her words threading between the calls of vendors hawking onions and the shuffle of boots on packed earth. "The entailment document already circulates among the tenants. One copy reached the parson yesterday, another the miller by evening. They compare signatures and wonder which distant relative will next claim the coastal acres. The Earl's seal appears genuine, yet the timing suggests someone hurried the ink dry." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of a loaf as though testing its warmth. Kezia noted the slight tension in Halima's shoulders, the way her gaze flicked toward the road twice in the space of a breath. Kezia's fingers found the rim of an imaginary cup and traced it once before she steadied the basket again. The motion steadied her breathing without drawing notice from passers-by. She kept her gaze on the loaves rather than the speaker, though the memory of steam rising from porcelain offered brief respite from the tightening in her chest. What did Halima truly risk by speaking so plainly? And how much of that risk had already transferred to her own name? The crowd shifted with the arrival of a cart loaded with early apples, their skins catching the light like polished coins. Halima's hand brushed hers briefly, the contact quick and deliberate. A folded note passed between them without comment. Kezia slipped it into her basket beneath the rosemary and moved toward the striped awning of the baker's stand, the paper's edge pressing against her palm like a second pulse. She could feel the weight of unseen watchers in the way conversations dipped as she passed. Under the canvas shade, she unfolded the paper just enough to read the brief lines. The script was Halima's own, careful and economical. The writer observed at dusk had returned twice more, each time carrying a sealed packet toward the Harrington boundary. No name was attached to the message, only the hour and direction. Kezia read it twice, committing the details to memory, while the herbalist behind the counter watched the road with practiced indifference. The scent of yeast and warm crusts filled the space, yet it did nothing to ease the unease settling in her stomach. Who carried those packets, and what did they contain that required such secrecy under cover of evening light? Halima remained at the edge of the awning, eyes on the road where carts turned toward the lanes. Her posture suggested she would not speak further unless addressed, though the slight tilt of her head invited the question. Kezia held back. Mr. Leandro Quinn crossed the square from the direction of the inn, arms already folded across his chest at the sight of the two women together. He halted a respectful distance, yet made no move to continue past them, his boots planted firmly as though anchoring the moment and place. "Miss Thorne," he said, the words clipped, though the volume remained moderate. "I had not expected market day to draw you from the lighthouse so soon after your arrival." His gaze moved from her basket to Halima and back, a silent assessment that lingered a beat too long. Kezia inclined her head. "The garden requires what the stalls supply, Mr. Quinn. One cannot live on solitude alone." She adjusted the basket higher on her hip, the note now hidden, but its presence a steady reminder against her side. Quinn's stance eased a fraction, though the arms stayed crossed. Solitude draws less comment than shared counsel with those whose affairs lie outside one's own household. "The tenants notice such meetings, Miss Thorne. They weigh every word exchanged beneath these awnings." Halima offered her single nod, this time directed at both of them, and stepped back into the flow of shoppers. The question of how many reputation points such guidance had already cost hung between the remaining two without further speech. Kezia returned the note to her basket and turned toward the road that led past the repaired gate, the weight of the paper heavier than the herbs it rested beside. Chapter 4. Chapter title, Gathering Gone Astray. Earl Waleed Harrington stood on the Harrington terrace and directed the footman to shift the last mahogany chair 2 inches leftward. The placement followed the diagram Miss Thorne had sketched on the boundary wall 3 days prior, its lines still clear in his mind. The sea wind tugged at the edges of the linen tablecloth, but did not disturb the row of teacups already set in even intervals. He watched the footman's hands adjust the final inch, then another fraction, until the alignment satisfied some private standard he could not name. The chairs faced the garden path in precise order, their backs catching the afternoon sun that slanted across the repaired stones. Waleed's fingers tightened briefly around the edge of the nearest table before he released it. He had not expected the wind to carry the faint tang of salt so sharply today, nor the way it lifted dust from the lane below and deposited it against the hem of his coat. The first carriage arrived while the servants were still straightening the final seat. Its wheels crunched over gravel that had been raked only that morning, the sound carrying farther than Waleed had anticipated. Lady Marston descended with her daughter, both in pale sprigged muslin that caught the afternoon light and fluttered against their ankles as they approached the steps. Waleed greeted them at the steps, his shoulders angled slightly away as he offered the required civilities. He noted the way Lady Marston's gaze moved past him to the empty chairs and the untouched teapot, her expression remaining composed even as her daughter's hand tightened on her elbow. "Lady Marston, the garden has recovered enough to welcome visitors again," he said, voice low and measured. She inclined her head without comment on the estate's recent neglect, though her eyes lingered on the boundary wall where fresh mortar still showed pale against the older stone. The daughter offered a small curtsy that did not quite reach the ground before she stepped back, her muslin skirt brushing the terrace rail. Lord Darius Harrington arrived in the next group, his coat cut narrower than custom allowed for a country afternoon. The fabric pulled taut across his shoulders as he moved, and the buttons caught the light in a way that suggested recent polishing. He paused beside the matron whose name Waleed could never quite retain and leaned forward until their shoulders nearly touched. The words reached Quinn, who had entered last and already stood with arms folded across his chest, his boots planted firmly on the gravel as though he meant to remain there for the duration. Darius's voice carried just far enough, a low murmur that shaped the phrase, "proper distances," with deliberate care before he straightened again. Waleed turned to each arrival in turn, offering the silver tray of cups and the small plates of biscuits that had been baked that morning. When the same matron refused a second cup of tea, his deliberate greeting faltered for half a breath. He watched her fingers lift from the cup's handle without lifting it, her mouth forming a polite refusal that left the pot suspended in his hand. He set the silver pot down without remark, and instead offered the view of the repaired boundary wall, describing the work in measured phrases that did not invite further questions. The matron's nod came after a silence, and her departure followed shortly after, the carriage door closing with a soft click that echoed against the terrace stones. Quinn's arms tightened further across his coat, the fabric of his sleeves creasing under the pressure. The phrase I heard was improper proximity at the boundary wall, spoken with the sort of concern that travels faster than any carriage, he said, the words clipped. No one answered him directly. Instead, the remaining guests shifted their weight, skirts rustling and boots scraping lightly against the stone as eyes turned toward the lane. Quinn's jaw worked once, the muscle shifting beneath his skin, before he exhaled through his nose and adjusted his stance again. From her position behind the low stone wall that marked the edge of the Harrington grounds, Miss Kezia Thorne watched the small assembly. The wall's surface felt cool beneath her palm, even through the thin gloves she wore, and the herbs in her basket released a faint green scent each time the wind shifted. 2 carriages had already turned away before the tea things were cleared. Their wheels left fresh ruts in the lane dust, the tracks crossing over older impressions from earlier visits. She kept her fingers still on the folded note inside her basket, though the paper's edge pressed against her palm with each breath she took. The note contained only the hour and a direction, yet its presence now weighed more than the herbs beside it. She wondered whether the Earl had noticed her watching, or whether the afternoon silence would simply add another line to the gossip already circling the estate. Waleed did not attempt defense of the afternoon's purpose. Instead, he made one low request that the remaining guests join him for a brief tour of the ledgers in the library. The offer met only the sound of skirts rustling toward the waiting vehicles, the fabric whispering against itself as the women moved, their faces turned slightly aside. One guest murmured something about an appointment already scheduled, the words trailing off before they reached completion. The final carriage departed before any guest had moved toward the house, its wheels turning slowly at first, then gaining speed as the driver urged the horses onward. Darius's figure remained visible longest, his retreating back straight, as he raised a hand in what might have been farewell or dismissal. The question of whether the Earl's title could survive the first lost invitations lingered in the empty space between the terrace and the gate, pressing against the quiet that settled once the dust had begun to settle. Quinn lingered at the gate after the others had gone, his stance rigid once more. He offered no further phrase before turning toward his own modest holdings, the set of his shoulders unchanging as he walked away. The gate latch clicked behind him with finality, the sound carrying across the now empty terrace. Inside the house, the terrace door stood open. Waleed remained on the stone, the wind now carrying the faint scent of yeast from the village bakery across the boundary. He thought of the sealed packets Halima had mentioned at the market, and of the rider whose paws had drawn every eye. Neither matter could be addressed while invitations still cooled on the table. The thought circled once, then twice, before he turned his attention to the chairs left in their precise rows. Kezia stepped back from the wall. The note in her basket contained only the hour and a direction, yet its presence now weighed more than the herbs beside it. She wondered whether the Earl had noticed her watching, or whether the afternoon silence would simply add another line to the gossip already circling the estate. The sun lowered toward the lighthouse roof. No further carriages approached, and the chairs remained exactly where the footman had placed them according to her earlier sketch. The linen tablecloth lifted once more in the wind, then settled, the teacups still untouched in their even intervals. Chapter 5. Miss Kezia Thorne traced the edge of the letter from Miss Halima Voss with one fingertip, while the gravel path crunched beneath her half-boots. The words inside spoke of caution and an offer of further correspondence, yet the paper trembled slightly in the salt breeze that lifted the hem of her walking dress. She had chosen the estate boundary path precisely because no carriage could follow its uneven line without drawing notice. Morning light filtered through the low branches overhead, casting shifting patterns across the page, and each step released the faint bitterness of crushed leaves underfoot. Her breath came evenly, but her thoughts circled the same narrow question: how much longer could these private exchanges remain private when every hedgerow seemed to listen? Footsteps approached from the side lane without announcement. Earl Waleed Harrington fell into step beside her, his shoulders angled away from her direction even as his stride matched hers exactly. The fabric of his coat brushed the low hedge once, then no more. Kezia did not turn her head at once. She felt the air between them tighten, as though the path itself had narrowed in response. He carried no cane today, only his gloved hands clasped behind his back, and the absence of that small prop left his posture oddly exposed. "The ledgers remain unexamined," he said, voice low and deliberate. "Yet the absence of further invitations suggests the matter may soon be decided without them." Kezia kept her gaze on the folded sheet in her hand. "Solitude was the reason I took the cottage," she answered after a measured pause. "Now even the lighthouse beam seems to announce every step beyond its walls." She felt the weight of his attention settle on the letter without ever quite touching it. A small muscle moved at the corner of his mouth, quickly stilled. He walked on for several paces before replying, his boots striking the gravel in measured rhythm with hers. "You're cautioned as you credit," he said at last. "I find myself measuring every word I commit to paper these days, as though each one might be read aloud before the assembly." She heard the effort it cost him to keep his tone even. The path curved slightly, and for a moment their sleeves nearly brushed. He checked his step at once, angling farther outward so that a thin strip of air remained between them. Kezia's fingers tightened on the letter's edge. She wondered how much of his restraint stemmed from fear of observers, and how much from the simple habit of guarding what remained of his name. They continued in silence for several paces. The path narrowed where the cliff began its rise, forcing them closer until the wind carried the faint scent of yeast from the distant bakery. Waleed adjusted his hat once, a small motion that revealed the tension in his jaw. The low hedge gave way to open grass on their right, and the sea's steady murmur rose to meet them, threaded with the sharper cry of gulls wheeling above the rocks. "My cousin's documents circulate with precision," he continued. "One signature could transfer the coastal holdings before the assembly meets. I had hoped quiet management might forestall the claim." Kezia studied the horizon for a moment before answering. "And I had hoped the garden walls would shield me from the need to weigh every word spoken in company," she replied. Her fingers returned to the paper's edge, smoothing a crease that had not been there before. She sensed, rather than saw, the way his shoulders tightened at the admission. It was the smallest shift, yet it spoke of shared ground neither of them wished to name aloud. The lighthouse beam swept across the path ahead, a pale arc that briefly illuminated the rough stones at their feet before moving on. They reached the cliff edge together. Kezia stopped first. The wind tugged at the loose strands of hair beneath her bonnet, carrying the salt tang more sharply now, and she felt the sudden exposure of standing so high above the water. Below, waves broke against the rocks in irregular rhythms, their sound rising and falling like uncertain breath. "Further letters might yet steady the ground beneath both our positions," she said. "I will write to Miss Voss this evening and ask what arrangements remain possible before the assembly." She let her thumb rest against the folded edge of the letter, tracing the slight ridge where Halima's seal had once pressed. Waleed did not answer at once. He remained half-turned from her, gaze fixed on the shifting water, yet she could feel the consideration passing through him, heavy and deliberate. Beyond the trees a curtain in the nearest cottage window shifted, the movement brief yet unmistakable. Neither spoke of it. Waleed turned back toward the house path, shoulders still angled, while Kezia remained a moment longer with the letter pressed between her palms. The fabric of his coat caught the light once as he moved away, then vanished among the hedgerows. The following morning, a second sheet arrived from Miss Halima Voss, delivered by a village boy who waited only for confirmation of receipt before departing. Kezia stood at her garden gate, the scent of salt heavy in the morning air, and unfolded the brief lines. The walk had been noted by at least 2 observers, the note stated, and questions already formed concerning the absence of a chaperone. She read the words twice, letting the paper tremble slightly in her grasp. The boy's footsteps had already faded down the lane, leaving only the gate's faint creak and the distant slap of water against stone. Inside the cottage, the kettle sang on the hearth, yet she did not move toward it. She read the words twice, then carried the paper inside to the small writing table near the window. Sunlight slanted across the oak surface, catching on the inkwell's brass rim. The pen moved steadily across fresh paper as she formed her reply, asking whether affection itself could still be weighed against the coming assembly without immediate ruin to either reputation. Each sentence required deliberate care. She paused between them to listen to the garden beyond the open casement, where bees moved among the late roses, and the air carried the faint metal-sharp edge of the tide. The question remained unanswered on the page when she folded the sheet and reached for the sealing wax. What assembly could possibly restore what one unchaperoned path has already placed at hazard? She asked aloud as the wax cooled beneath her fingers. The garden gate stood ajar behind her, and through it the path stretched empty, waiting. Chapter 6. Chapter title: Herbalist Networks. Miss Halima Voss lifted the latch on the weathered gate of the first cottage and stepped onto the packed earth path, her bundle of dried lavender and rosemary tied with plain twine resting against her forearm. Salt from the nearby tide clung to the air, sharpening the scent of the herbs into something brisk and medicinal. A folded slip of paper, its edge barely visible, lay tucked between the stems. She adjusted the bundle once, the motion small enough to pass for habit, and felt the weight of the hidden message settle against her wrist. The tenant's wife opened the door at once and accepted the herbs with a quiet word of thanks, her eyes lingering on the note before she slipped it into her apron pocket. Her fingers brushed the twine a second longer than necessary, and Halima caught the faint tightening at the corner of the woman's mouth. An acknowledgment, nothing more. Halima offered no further remark and moved on along the narrow lane that wound between the low stone walls, the sound of her steps softened by the damp earth. The same afternoon brought 2 wagons of grain to the tenant holdings farther along the shore road. Earl Waleed Harrington stood at the edge of the yard, shoulders angled away from the gathering, and watched the sacks carried into the storehouse. Dust from the grain rose in thin clouds, catching the low sunlight and turning the air hazy between the buildings. He spoke only to confirm the measure for each household, his low voice carrying no farther than the man beside him. The tenants accepted the delivery without ceremony, though several glanced toward the Earl before returning to their work. One man hesitated, his hand resting on a sack as if testing its weight against some private calculation. Waleed noted the pause but made no move to intervene, letting the moment pass into the steady rhythm of unloading. By evening, the small assembly hall near the harbor had filled with local families and a scattering of visiting gentry. The scent of damp wool and lamp oil hung thick beneath the rafters. Lord Darius Harrington entered with measured steps, his coat freshly brushed, and his expression arranged in lines of mild interest. He paused near the refreshment table and addressed the first group of women already seated there. "One hears the most curious reports of late walks along the cliff paths," he said, the words smooth and edged with concern. "Particularly when a retired governess is said to meet a titled visitor without proper attendance." His gaze flicked briefly toward the window as he spoke, then returned to the women with the same polite curve at his mouth. The women exchanged glances but offered no immediate reply, their teacups shifting in gloved hands. Halima entered a moment later and took a place near the window, her posture straight. She listened without comment until Darius leaned closer to repeat a second detail about documents left carelessly on a writing table. Then she gave a single sharp nod toward the door. The 3 women rose together, murmured excuses about waiting carriages, and left the circle without looking back. One paused at the threshold to smooth her skirt, the motion deliberate, before stepping into the corridor. Darius watched their departure with no change in his expression, though the fingers of his left hand tapped once against the table edge before stilling. Earl Waleed remained at the edge of the room, hands clasped behind his back. As each ally approached to report the grain had reached its destination, he thanked them by name in the same deliberate tone. "Mrs. Reed, your assistance with the storehouse records has been precise," he said to one. "Mr. Brunn, Ellis, the ledgers you reviewed yesterday require only your final signature." His thanks drew no attention from the larger company, yet each recipient straightened slightly before moving away. Waleed tracked the departures from the corner of his eye, noting the slight lift in their shoulders that suggested the words had landed as intended. A boy in a plain coat brought Kezia's note to the hall and placed it in Halima's hand during a brief pause near the side door. The message, written in measured lines on plain paper, warned that Mr. Leander Quinn had already heard the latest whisper concerning the unchaperoned path. Kezia's fingers had left a faint trace of ink at the edge where the pen had rested too long. Halima read the note once, folded it, and returned to the main room without altering her expression, though the faint pressure of her thumb against the paper betrayed the second reading she gave it in her mind. Through the course of the next hour, Halima's quiet exchanges secured 2 additional invitations for the Earl to review estate matters with neighboring families. She spoke directly, yet kept her voice low enough that only the intended listener caught each word. The agreements were given with brief handshakes rather than formal declarations, and the recipients departed before Darius could approach them again. One man lingered a moment longer, his eyes meeting hers in silent confirmation before he turned toward the door. Lord Darius watched from the far side of the hall as the final target, a widow whose late husband had held a minor interest in the entailment papers, accepted Halima's suggestion and stepped through the outer door. His smile remained unchanged, the corners of his mouth lifted in the same polite curve he had worn upon entering. He turned to the remaining company and offered a remark about the local tea, his voice carrying no trace of the setback. The assembly thinned as the hour grew late. Earl Walid collected his hat from the attendant and paused once at the threshold. The empty hall still held the scent of the grain dust that had clung to the wagons earlier, mixed now with the faint trace of rosemary from Halima's bundles. He did not speak of the note or the invitations aloud. Beyond the harbor, the lighthouse beam swept across the water at regular intervals. Miss Kessia Thorne sat at her writing table with the garden gate still ajar. The sealing wax from her earlier letter cooled, but the question of the assembly unanswered. She traced the rim of her teacup once, then set it aside. Mr. Leandro Quinn stood outside the hall and crossed his arms while he waited for his carriage. He had heard the whisper, as the note stated, yet he had not repeated it inside. The question remained whether his silence would hold through the following day. Halima walked the lane back toward her own cottage, the remaining bundles lighter now. She nodded once to a passing tenant who had received both grain and a private word of support. The night air carried the metal edge of the tide. In the empty assembly hall, the last candle guttered. The question of how long estate gains could outpace the next inheritance threat lingered among the unused chairs, unanswered by any voice present. Chapter 7. Miss Kessia Thorne turned the heavy paper once more upon her cottage table, the ball invitation lying open beside her cooled teacup. The seal bore the crest of a London house, whose name she had not spoken aloud in months, and the date pressed against her thumb as she aligned it with the ledger of estate notes that still required her quiet counsel. Lantern light caught the edge of a silk ribbon she had set aside for the journey, its color too bright against the faded wood. The flame guttered softly with each breath of wind through the half-open window, casting elongated shadows across the stacked papers. Outside, the tide whispered against the shingle, a steady rhythm that usually steadied her thoughts, yet tonight it only sharpened the unease coiled beneath her ribs. She reached for the quill to mark the hour of departure, then paused when the garden gate clicked without the usual knock. Mr. Leandro Quinn stepped through the frame, his coat dusted from the lane, yet his cravat untouched. He did not wait for permission before crossing to the table, his gaze fixed on the open card. "This association continues at peril to every name attached," he said, the words clipped and even. "Your name appears on the list beside Harrington's. Mine will not follow." Kessia set the quill down without lifting her eyes from the paper. She measured the silence between his sentence and her reply, tracing the cup rim with one fingertip until the porcelain warmed beneath it. The motion steadied her pulse even as doubt flickered through her mind. What did Quinn truly fear beyond the entailment? "Connection need not equal ruin when conducted with care," she answered at last. The pause after each phrase held the weight of the answer she withheld. She wondered whether her words sounded as hollow to him as they felt to her. Quinn's arms stayed folded across his chest, the stance unchanged from the moment he entered. He shifted his weight once, boots scraping the flagstone, yet the barrier of his posture did not ease. "Care has already drawn notice," he said. "Darius carries the tale to every neighbor whose favor might sway the entailment." His voice carried no rise, only the finality of a man who had weighed the cost to his own holdings. His jaw tightened briefly before settling back into its rigid line, and Kessia caught the flicker of something more, perhaps regret or simple exhaustion, behind his steady stare. The door latch lifted again before Kessia could form the next measured response. Miss Halima Voss stood at the threshold, 2 bundles of dried herbs tucked beneath one arm. She offered a single sharp nod toward the table, the gesture sufficient to signal that the London season list had already been altered in the village record. No further word passed between them. Halima set the bundles beside the door and withdrew into the lane. Kessia noted the slight hesitation in her friend's step, a silent acknowledgment of shared risk that lingered after the latch clicked shut once more. Kessia's fingers returned to the cup rim, the motion slower now. She broke the invitation's remaining seal under her thumb, the wax yielding with a faint crack that echoed against the cottage walls. The scent of rosemary from Halima's bundles mingled with the salt air that entered through the open door, threading through the room like an uninvited witness. Quinn watched the motion without unfolding his arms, his eyes tracking the fragments as they scattered across the wood grain. A rider approached along the garden path before either spoke again. The sealed letter he delivered bore Earl Walid Harrington's hand, delivered the same hour as Quinn's arrival. Kessia read the brief lines at the table. The Earl asked whether she would attend, despite the risk to both names, and whether the estate ledgers could wait until after the assembly. She placed the letter beside the broken invitation, her thoughts turning over the Earl's careful phrasing. Did he sense the same tightening net? Or was this merely another test of her resolve? My holdings cannot absorb further whispers, Quinn said from the doorway, his final warning delivered without turning back. The entailment papers already list every connection that might be questioned. He stepped into the lane, arms still crossed, and the gate closed behind him with the same click that had announced his entrance. The sound reverberated longer than it should have, settling into the quiet spaces between her breaths. Kessia remained at the table, the invitation and the Earl's letter now side by side. The lantern flame wavered once as the night breeze moved through the open door. She did not reach for the ribbon again. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap, the earlier tracing of the cup rim leaving a faint warmth on her fingertip. The question of whether reputation still served as armor for either of them settled across the empty surface, unanswered by the remaining papers or the distant sound of the tide. Outside the cottage, the harbor light swept its beam across the water at regular intervals, catching the edge of a carriage that waited beyond the lane. Quinn's silhouette crossed before it, the arms still folded, before the vehicle carried him toward his own modest property. Kessia rose only to secure the door, yet the seal fragments remained on the table where she had left them. The invitation's date seemed to press against the wood even after she extinguished the lantern. She returned to her chair in the dark, the Earl's letter still open beside the cup. The words asked for her presence at the ball, but the cost of that presence lingered in the silence Quinn had left. Reputation had once shielded her from city scrutiny. Here, beside the sea, it threatened to close doors that quiet kindness had begun to open. She traced the rim once more, though the porcelain held no warmth now, and considered how many names might yet be struck from lists because of a single association. Halima's bundles gave off their steady scent, a reminder of the alliances secured at the assembly without public declaration. The altered season list meant one fewer name would stand beside hers, yet the Earl's question remained. Kessia considered the ledgers that still required review before any departure. The entailment threat moved faster than estate gains, and the ball offered both opportunity and exposure. The cottage settled into quiet as the tide turned. No further rider arrived. Kessia sat with the invitation and the letter until the first light touched the garden gate. The unresolved question of armor and connection stayed with her, carried forward into the preparations she could no longer delay. Chapter 8. Kessia folded the invitation once more before placing it beside the Earl's letter on the table. The lantern had burned low during the night, its flame steady now against the first gray light at the window, casting long shadows across the scattered papers that documented every attempt to secure their position. She rose and secured the door against the turning tide, the bolt sliding home with a muted click that seemed to echo the finality of the choice she had made. Then she stepped toward the waiting carriage without looking back at the harbor beam sweeping the water, its rhythmic pulse a reminder of the distance already growing between the quiet certainties of the cottage and the uncertain ground that waited in London. At the London Assembly, the chandeliers hung low over the polished floor, their crystals catching the movement of silk and velvet while throwing fractured light across spaces turned carefully neutral. Earl Waleed Harrington stood near the far wall, shoulders angled slightly away from the nearest cluster of guests, the posture of a man who knew every glance carried weight. A dowager in pale lavender addressed him directly, her fan half raised as though it might shield her from the answer she sought. He answered in a low voice that carried only to her ear, each word measured and complete, though inside he measured the cost of every syllable against the rumors already circling like smoke. Lord Darius Harrington circled the edge of the room once, his gaze fixed on the Earl with the patience of a man who had rehearsed this moment. He paused beside the dowager and leaned forward, his expression arranged in lines of false concern that drew the eye without seeming to demand it. The entailment papers, he said, had already been drawn and would reach the solicitors before the month closed. His tone suggested regret rather than triumph. Yet 3 heads turned toward him at once, the movement subtle but decisive, like guests shifting away from a draft. Miss Kessia Thorne stood beneath her chaperone's watchful eye at the refreshment table, the press of bodies around her offering momentary cover. Her fingers adjusted the edge of her glove rather than tracing any rim. A small motion that drew no notice yet allowed her to slip the folded square of paper into the attendant's waiting palm without a word. The square traveled onward along the table's cloth, passed between trays of untouched ices, its journey invisible amid the low murmur of conversations that never quite reached her. Mr. Leandro Quinn watched from across the floor, arms crossed as they had been the previous evening, the stance of a man still deciding where his loyalty might settle. A second whisper reached toward the Earl from another quarter, this one carrying the sharp edge of speculation about past debts and future claims. Quinn uncrossed his arms and stepped forward, intercepting the speaker with a clipped question about the new drainage works on his own land. The words were ordinary, yet the timing cut the whisper short before it could reach the Dowager, and Quinn's shoulders eased fractionally as the speaker redirected his attention. The Earl replied to the lavender fan without raising his volume, his gaze steady on the Dowager's face, as though the rest of the room had ceased to exist. The coastal holdings required only careful management, he said, and the ledgers already showed improvement under recent guidance. He offered no defense beyond the plain facts. Yet one name was restored to the evening's list, before the current set concluded, the Dowager's nod so slight it might have been overlooked by anyone not watching for it. Darius drew 3 additional listeners with a further remark on the risks of association, his voice pitched low enough to invite leaning closer. The nearest guests shifted their positions, creating a wider space around the Earl where the floor had been crowded moments earlier, the movement carrying the quiet force of a tide pulling away from shore. Kezia's note arrived at his hand during the brief interval between sets, delivered by the same attendant who had accepted it earlier, the square warm from its passage through careful fingers. Walid opened the square beneath the shelter of his cuff, the single line reading that the cottage ledgers remained open for review upon his return. The words steadied something inside him that had begun to fray under the weight of each new question, and he answered the next inquiry from a neighboring landowner with the same deliberate tone, the note's presence steadying the cadence of each phrase, even as his thoughts turned to the woman who had sent it and the price she paid for remaining unseen. The musicians struck the opening chords of the final dance, the strings rising above the diminishing conversations. Couples moved toward the center while the Earl remained at the wall, the note still folded against his palm, its edges creasing further under the pressure of his thumb. Kezia stood at the opposite side of the room, her chaperone's attention now turned toward an arriving carriage outside the tall windows, the momentary distraction granting her one clear line of sight across the floor to the man who had accepted her message without looking up. Darius lingered near the Dowager, his posture relaxed yet positioned to observe every departure, the angle of his head suggesting he catalogued each guest who still lingered near the Earl. Quinn remained nearby, his stance no longer rigid, though he offered no further word, his eyes tracking the slow drift of the crowd as though measuring how much ground had been lost. The question of whether the evening's defense would preserve or further compromise the standing of both the Earl and the former governess hung in the space between the remaining guests and the opening figures of the dance, unanswered and sharpening with every passing measure. The Dowager's fan closed with a soft snap. She extended her hand to Walid for the set, her expression unchanged, the gesture carrying the weight of a public choice made under the eyes of those who had already begun to turn away. He accepted without hesitation, the note disappearing into his coat as they stepped forward. The chandeliers continued their slow sway above the floor, catching the edge of the lavender silk as the couple entered the pattern, their joined hands visible to anyone still watching. Kezia watched the movement from her place at the table. Her chaperone returned from the window with news of another arrival, yet the single line from the cottage remained the only certainty carried into the dance. The assembly would continue until the carriages lined the street once more, and the entailment rumors would travel with them, carried in the same carriages that had brought the guests and would now carry their judgments home. Chapter 9. The courier's horse had scarcely turned the bend when Kezia Thorne lifted the folded sheets from the gravel at the estate gate. Salt wind tugged at the edges, carrying the sharp tang of seaweed and whetstone from the cliffs below. Ink smeared beneath her thumb, still fresh enough to mark the linen of her glove with a dark crescent. The terms sprawled across the page in a clerk's precise hand. The entailment claim listed every acre of the Harrington holdings, with Darius Harrington's name inserted where Walid's ought to stand. She read the final clause twice, the paper crackling in the steady gust that blew in from the sea. Her pulse quickened, though she kept her face still. The words felt less like a legal notice, and more like a quiet theft already in progress. A tenant's cart rumbled past the Lighthouse cottage before noon. The wheels crunched over loose stones, and the driver, a man whose fields bordered the eastern boundary, called across the low wall without dismounting. His voice carried the flat caution of someone repeating news he wished he had not heard. Word in the village says the Earl must quit before quarter day. The papers name another master already. He touched his hat, eyes flicking once toward the cottage windows, as though checking for watchers, then drove on. The wheels left fresh ruts in the lane, and the smell of turned earth lingered. Kezia set the kettle aside untouched. Steam rose and faded against the cold panes. She changed neither her walking dress nor her gloves before setting out, though her fingers lingered on the latch as she considered the distance she was about to cross. The path to the main house cut through the kitchen garden, Rosemary released its scent as her skirts brushed the stems and thyme crushed underfoot added a sharper note. Gulls wheeled overhead, their calls thin against the wind. At the study door she paused only long enough to smooth the papers against her palm, feeling the damp edge once more. Her mind turned over the tenant's words and the ink still drying on the page. Retreating now would only widen the space she had already begun to close. Waleed Harrington stood at the window overlooking the drive, shoulders angled toward the sea rather than the room. Light from the gray afternoon caught the edge of his profile, revealing the tension in his jaw. He turned at the sound of the latch, the movement deliberate, as though he had been expecting interruption, but not this one. "Miss Thorne," he said, the words low and unhurried. "The hour is early for calls." She placed the documents on the desk between them. The oak surface felt solid beneath her hand, anchoring her against the impulse to withdraw. These arrived at the gate this morning. The ink had not yet dried. Her fingers remained on the edge of the top sheet, tracing the margin once before she withdrew her hand. She watched him study the distance she had kept between the desk and the door, noting how his gaze measured it without comment. He did not reach for them at once. Instead, he studied the space between them, the faint crease at the corner of his mouth suggesting he weighed her presence against the risk of being seen together. "Darius moves quickly when the tone sits unguarded," he observed. The pause that followed allowed the clock on the mantel to mark 3 full seconds, each one stretching the silence. "The tenant who passed the cottage spoke of relocation before quarter day," she continued after a measured pause. "I thought the information should not wait." Her gloves still carried the faint smear. She resisted the urge to rub them clean. Waleed's gaze returned to her face. "He might have sent a note by the same hand that brought these." He indicated the papers with a slight motion of his wrist, yet his shoulders remained turned half away, as though part of him still faced the cliffs and the questions they held. "I considered it," Kezia said. The pause lengthened until the clock on the mantel marked the seconds again. She felt the weight of the choice she had made, the walk through the garden now seeming both necessary and dangerous. "I chose instead to come myself. The distance between the cottage and this room has grown narrower than the distance between reputation and fact." Her voice stayed even, but the admission settled between them like a stone dropped into still water. He lowered himself into the chair behind the desk without shifting the papers. His fingers rested on the armrest, drumming once before stilling. "Then we are agreed that the estate requires a steadier hand than rumor supplies." The words carried agreement, yet his eyes searched hers for the deeper current beneath them. A soft scrape sounded beneath the door. The corner of a sealed letter appeared on the carpet, pushed forward by an unseen footstep that retreated at once. Kezia retrieved it, the wax cool against her fingertips. The seal bore Darius's signet. The imprint crisped. She broke it and read the single line aloud. "The Dowager's choice last evening changes nothing when the tone already names the heir." The sentence hung in the air, its brevity more threatening than any longer threat. Waleed accepted the letter from her without comment. He folded it once and set it beside the entailment sheets, the motion precise. The lighthouse beam swept across the study window, its white flash illuminating the ink stains on Kezia's glove and the faint tremor in her fingers before they steadied. Her hand rested again on the papers, still and deliberate. "If the alliance we form here is to stand," he said at last, voice lower now, "it must withstand the cost the tone now places upon it." He did not look away, and the admission of shared risk lingered in the space between them. Keisha met his eyes across the desk. The beam passed again, casting shifting light over the documents. "The question remains whether any choice made in this room can survive once the carriages carry the news home." Neither moved to answer it. The papers lay open, the letter beside them, while outside the wind continued its steady press against the glass. Chapter 10. Waleed Harrington drew the final letter from its envelope at the terrace table, its surface now free of moss, and set with a single oil lamp whose flame held steady against the evening breeze. The restored stones beneath his boots still carried the faint scent of salt from the morning scrubbing, and the papers lay in ordered rows beside a pen and a fresh sheet of foolscap. His shoulders angled slightly away from the open view of the sea as he read the confirmation from the last solicitor, the words confirming the estate's accounts now balanced without the prior encumbrances. Yet the victory felt thin, the ink on the page insufficient against the larger ledger of names and glances that would greet them once the season resumed. He traced the edge of the foolscap with one fingertip, listening to the distant roll of waves that seemed to measure each second of the silence he had chosen. Halima Voss appeared at the garden gate without announcement, her nod sharp once she caught his eye. She moved with the measured tread of one who had spent years carrying messages between divided rooms, her cloak drawn close against the cooling air. "The last of the neutral voices has spoken," she said, voice direct, yet carrying the soft accent of her upbringing. "The assembly will disperse before any further word from London can alter their stance." She placed a folded note on the table's edge and withdrew at once, leaving the paper unopened for the moment, though her eyes lingered a fraction longer on the separate stack of invitations already set aside. Walid watched her retreat along the path, noting the way her shoulders held the posture of a person who had delivered worse news before and learned not to wait for thanks. He broke the seal himself. The message stated only that 3 houses had declined Darius Harrington's calls that afternoon, their doors remaining shut to his inquiries. A faint tightening moved through Walid's jaw as he set it beside the alliance letters without comment. He could picture his cousin at each threshold, the polite refusal, the drawn curtains, the sound of bolts sliding home, and wondered how many of those refusals had come from men who once owed Darius favors. The thought pressed against the relief of the signed accounts, reminding him that security on paper rarely survived the first evening of return scrutiny. He reached instead for the betrothal document prepared earlier that week, its creases still sharp from the rector's careful folding. Kezia Thorne approached from the cottage path, her fingers tracing once along the rim of the cup she carried before she set it down untouched. The steam had long since faded, leaving only the faint trace of cooled tea on the air. She stood at his right hand, her presence steady yet charged with the same restrained awareness that had marked every exchange since the Restoration began. Walid felt the weight of her silence as he signed the agreement under the witness of the local rector, who added his own mark in silence, the quill scratching across parchment like a single thread pulled taut. The title document followed, its seal now restored and the coastal holdings secured against the entailment claim. Kezia's gaze remained on the signatures rather than the distant water, as if counting the cost in each stroke of ink. A separate stack of forfeited London invitations rested at the far corner of the table, their edges aligned by Halima's earlier visit. Walid's fingers rested on the arm of the chair, drumming once before they stilled. He could smell the faint must of the paper, the same stock used for every season's round of calls, now rendered useless by the choices etched across the other documents. "The cost stands higher than the ledgers alone record," he said, voice low and deliberate. "Each signature here removes another invitation that will not be replaced." The words settled between them without echo. Kezia's hand hovered briefly near the invitations before withdrawing, her expression composed yet shadowed by the knowledge that these refusals would multiply once the Ton learned the full shape of their agreement. Kezia remained beside him, her posture measured as the rector withdrew down the path, his footsteps fading into the rustle of evening wind through the low hedges. The agreement lay complete between them, its terms plain yet binding under the law of the realm. Outside the low wall, the first stars appeared above the waterline, pricking the darkening sky like distant signals. Walid studied the way her sleeve brushed the table's edge, the small motion betraying nothing and everything at once. He wondered how many evenings would pass before such proximity became its own test, the boundary between neighbor and betrothed narrowing under eyes that had already begun to measure every glance. They walked together toward the boundary wall as dusk settled, the path cleared of the earlier debris. Walid kept his steps even, his gaze on the ground ahead rather than the horizon, the crunch of gravel underfoot a steady counterpoint to the rising tide. Kezia matched his pace, the hem of her dress brushing the stones without sound, though her breathing carried the faint quickening of one who held questions she would not yet voice. The air grew cooler, carrying the brine of the sea and the faint green scent of disturbed earth from the restored garden beds. He could feel the unspoken ledger between them, the names already lost, the gatherings they would attend as near strangers, the careful distance required until summer's end. At the wall they paused. The lighthouse beams swept across the restored terrace and the cottage garden, illuminating the chaste space between them before moving on. Its light caught the pale stone of the boundary and the dark line of the sea beyond, then vanished into the gathering dark. Walid turned slightly, his profile outlined against the flash of light. "The Ton will test this at the next gathering," he observed, the words carrying no rise in volume. He felt the question press at the back of his throat whether the same doors that closed on Darius would one day close on them both, but held it. Kezia's hand rested on the wall's top, steady now. "The alliance holds only if we name its limits before others do." The beam returned, casting a brief light over the separate stack of invitations visible from where they stood. She did not look at him directly, yet the angle of her shoulders suggested she tracked every shift in his stance, every hesitation left unspoken. Waleed named the cost once more in the same deliberate tone. Reputation requires that we meet as neighbors only until the season ends. The salt air carried the words without echo, and for a moment the only sound was the distant rush of water against the rocks. The vista of the secured estate stretched before them, the cottage lights now visible through the restored windows, warm and contained. Neither moved to return inside. The beam swept again, its path unbroken across the boundary wall, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch the distance between them even as they stood side by side. Waleed felt the weight of the evening settle deeper, the promise of future visits already tempered by the knowledge that each one would be weighed and measured by those who had not yet spoken their final word. "Can the cost be borne without further loss?" Waleed asked, turning his head to meet her eyes at last, "when the next assembly demands we stand apart?" The question lingered in the salt air, unanswered, while the lighthouse beam continued its measured sweep over the estate they had reclaimed.